My name is Diego, and what I am about to tell you still sends chills down my spine. It all started as a simple road trip with my family. My wife, our 2 kids, and I were excited about the adventure that awaited us. We had planned to visit relatives on the other side of the country, and we decided to make it a road trip to enjoy the scenery and spend time together. Little did we know that this trip would turn into our worst nightmare. The first day of the trip was perfect. We left early in the morning, the weather was nice, and the kids were excited about the adventure. We drove for hours, enjoying the music and the views. But everything changed on the second day. We decided to take a shortcut on a secondary road to save time. The road was scarcely traveled, and soon we realized it wasn't a good idea. Halfway through, the car started making strange noises, and before we could react, it stopped completely. I tried restarting it several times, but it was no use. We were stranded on a deserted road with no cell signal. The sun was setting, and the cold of the night was starting to settle in. We decided to wait until morning to try and find help. We spent the night in the car, but none of us could sleep well. We heard strange noises in the dark, like branches cracking and soft footsteps around the car. The next morning, we decided our best option was to walk and find help. We took some provisions and started walking along the road. As we walked, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The kids were scared, and my wife tried to stay calm. Suddenly, we heard the sound of an engine. We turned around and saw an old truck approaching. At first, we felt relieved, but that feeling quickly disappeared when we saw the driver. He was a sinister-looking man with a smile that didn't bode well. The man offered to give us a ride, but something in his eyes made us doubt. When we politely declined, his smile vanished, and he became aggressive. He shouted at us to get into the truck, but we decided to keep walking. The man followed us for a while, shouting and cursing, but eventually he left. We thought we had gotten lucky, but we had no idea the real nightmare was just beginning. That night, we camped near the road. The cold was intense, and we tried to stay warm with the blankets we had. The noises in the forest kept us on high alert. Suddenly, we heard footsteps and saw shadows moving among the trees. We realized we were being followed by a group of criminals who used that road to trap unsuspecting travelers. We spent the night in a state of absolute terror, unable to sleep. We knew we had to keep moving. At dawn, we gathered our things and started walking again. After several hours, we finally reached a small town. Exhausted and terrified, we went to the local police station and told them our story. The police told us that the secondary road was known to be dangerous and that several people had disappeared in the area. We felt fortunate to have survived. The experience left a lasting mark on us. Now, every time we plan a trip, we take all necessary precautions and avoid any shortcuts we don't know. I will never forget the faces of my children, scared but brave, nor the determination of my wife to keep us safe. I am grateful every day that we made it out of that nightmare alive and together as a family. The road, which once symbolized freedom and adventure, now only represents danger and uncertainty for us. We tried to continue our lives as normally as possible after that, but the events of that trip haunted us. Marta moved to a different city, trying to escape the memories. Javier, another friend who was with us, started attending therapy to deal with the trauma. As for me, I couldn't step into a cabin or even think about going to the mountains without feeling a deep sense of dread. Every noise in my house, every creak in the floorboards, took me back to that night. I became hyper-aware of my surroundings, always expecting to see that madman standing behind me. My dreams were plagued with images of Carlos, his face appearing in dark corners and his voice calling out for help. I often woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. The authorities investigated the cabin thoroughly, They discovered that the man living in the basement had been presumed dead years ago in a similar storm. He had survived by hiding in the cabin, scavenging food and supplies from unsuspecting visitors. His mental state had deteriorated over time, leading him to believe that anyone who came near the cabin was an intruder. Despite knowing the facts, the fear didn't subside. We had faced a real-life horror, and the scars were not just physical. They were embedded deep within our psyche. We tried to support each other, but the bond we once shared was now tainted by the traumatic experience. Our conversations, once filled with laughter and joy, were now strained and guarded. Months passed, and I decided to write about our experience as a form of therapy. I wanted to share our story, to warn others about the dangers that could lurk in the most unexpected places. As I wrote, I relived every moment, every sound, every fear. It was a painful process, but it also brought a sense of release. I realized that by facing my fears head-on, I could begin to heal. The story gained attention, and soon I was contacted by journalists and TV shows wanting to hear more about our ordeal. I hesitated at first, but then I saw it as an opportunity to spread awareness. I wanted people to be cautious, to be aware of their surroundings, and to understand that danger could strike at any moment. Through sharing our story, I connected with others who had faced similar traumas. Their stories were different, but the fear and pain were the same. We formed a support group, helping each other navigate the long road to recovery. Slowly, I began to reclaim parts of my life that I had lost to fear. I visited the mountains again, this time with a group of survivors from the support group. We stayed in a well-populated area, ensuring we were never alone. It was a small step, but it marked the beginning of my journey to overcome the terror that had gripped my life. The cabin in the mountains will always be a part of my story, a chapter filled with horror and pain. But it also serves as a reminder of my resilience and the strength I found within myself and my friends. We survived, and through our survival, we found a way to move forward, scarred but stronger. Today, I live with a new awareness and appreciation for life. I understand the fragility of our existence and the importance of cherishing every moment. The experience in that cabin taught me the value of friendship, the power of resilience, and the need for caution. It's a part of me now, shaping who I am and how I live. And while the nightmares may never fully disappear, I know I have the strength to face them, just as I faced that horrifying weekend in the mountains. I had been working for almost 12 hours straight, and by the time I got home, I was completely exhausted, both physically and mentally. As I entered my bedroom, I felt a wave of relief thinking about finally being able to relax. However, just as I was about to lie down on my bed, my phone made a sharp notification sound that pulled me out of my stupor of exhaustion. Wondering what could be so urgent, I reached for my nightstand and picked up my phone, squinting at the bright screen in the dimly lit room. Unlocking my phone, I noticed a message from an unknown number on the screen. The message read, "Do you miss me? I wish you would remember our first kiss." As I read the words, a chill ran down my spine. I felt a flood of unpleasant memories rushing through my mind. That night, I had been waiting outside the bar for Kelly, my girlfriend, for a few minutes. While I was there, I felt a sudden tap on my back that startled me. I turned around to see a girl with a green jacket smiling at me. She was quite beautiful, with long brown hair and bright brown eyes. However, something about her made me feel uneasy and scared. Maybe it was the way she looked at me with a touch of intensity. Her smile seemed a bit strange, as if she was trying too hard to make a good impression. She asked if I wanted to join her inside the bar, but I politely declined and told her I was waiting for my girlfriend. Her smile disappeared, and her face twisted into an unpleasant expression before she walked into the bar. A few minutes later, Kelly arrived, and we headed into the bar. We were having fun, enjoying each other's company, when I felt a piercing stare on us. Kelly noticed it too, and started looking around uncomfortably. I looked in the direction of the stare, and noticed the same girl sitting at the bar, watching us. When she saw that we noticed her, she quickly looked away. As the night went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still watching us. Finally, I asked Kelly if she wanted to go to my place, and she agreed. While driving, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, feeling like someone was following us, but every time I looked, there was no one there. As soon as we arrived at my apartment, I felt a sense of unease. I scanned the surroundings, looking for any signs of danger. Even though I couldn't see anyone suspicious, I still had the persistent feeling that someone was watching us. Not wanting to take any chances, I asked Kelly to stay close to me as we entered. After locking the door, we headed to the living room where we settled on the couch. We spent some time scrolling through movie options until we finally settled on a romantic movie. As the movie progressed, we became more comfortable with each other, and the room filled with the sound of laughter and whispered comments. Eventually, we found ourselves wrapped in each other's arms. Our lips met in a passionate kiss. We made love for what seemed like hours, our bodies entwined in a frenzy of desire. Finally, exhausted but content, we fell asleep in each other's arms, the warmth of our love still present in our bodies. I woke up in the middle of the night feeling a light touch on my hair. My first thought was that it must be Kelly, my girlfriend, trying to wake me up. Without opening my eyes, I reached out and grabbed the hand, but when I finally opened my eyes, I was shocked to see the girl who had been outside the bar that night standing at the edge of my bed. My heart started racing as I tried to understand what was happening. How had she gotten into my apartment? Why was she touching my hair? I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized we weren't alone in the room. I considered getting up and confronting the intruder, but my body was paralyzed by shock and fear. Suddenly, she leaned down and kissed me, and I was too stunned to react. It wasn't until I regained my senses that I confronted her. The commotion woke Kelly. She was startled to see a stranger in her house and demanded to know who she was. As I told her that I didn't know the girl grabbed the lamp from the table and lunged at Kelly. But before she could do anything, I grabbed her. While holding her, I asked Kelly to call 911. Kelly frantically dialed 911, her fingers trembling with fear. She recounted the events of the past few minutes to the operator. After what felt like an eternity, the sound of sirens broke the silence of the apartment. The police arrived, and their presence provided us with a sense of relief and security. As the officers escorted the creepy girl out, her eyes locked onto mine with a penetrating intensity that left me feeling uncomfortable. Even though they were taking her away, her gaze seemed to drill into me, sending chills down my spine and leaving me with an uneasy feeling. I'm relieved to say that I never saw that girl again after that terrible experience. It left me with such an uncomfortable feeling that lingered for a while. I remember hoping never to cross paths with her again. The thought of encountering her once more made me feel anxious and nervous. However, over time, I gradually forgot about her and moved past the experience. Oatman, Arizona, is a quirky little town that seems frozen in time. Nestled along Route 66, it's a place where the Old West still lingers, with its wooden sidewalks, rustic saloons, and burros roaming the streets. But it wasn't the town's charming facade that drew me there. It was the stories of ghosts that haunt its abandoned buildings. I arrived in Oatman late one afternoon, eager to explore and perhaps experience the supernatural for myself. I checked into an old hotel, rumored to be one of the most haunted places in town. The receptionist, an older woman with a knowing smile, handed me my key and said, "If you're lucky, you might get a visit from one of our resident spirits." I chuckled nervously and made my way to my room. The air was thick with history, and I could almost hear the whispers of the past. The hotel had an old-world charm, with creaky wooden floors and vintage decor. As I unpacked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I told myself it was just my imagination, stirred by the receptionist's comment. That evening, as the sun set and the town grew quiet, I ventured out to explore. The streets were eerily empty, save for the occasional bray of a burro. The rustic buildings cast long shadows in the dim light, and the air was filled with a sense of anticipation. I wandered into the old Oatman Hotel, a place teeming with ghost stories. As I stood in the dimly lit lobby, I felt a sudden chill. The air grew heavy, and I had the distinct feeling that I wasn't alone. I turned to see a figure standing at the top of the staircase. It was a man, dressed in old-fashioned mining attire. He looked at me with hollow eyes, and then, as quickly as he had appeared, he vanished. My heart raced as I tried to make sense of what I had just seen. The encounter left me shaken, and I decided to learn more about the ghosts of Oatman. The next day, I met with a local historian named Jack, who was well-versed in the town's haunted past. Jack was a friendly man with a passion for Oatman's history. He had lived there his entire life and had countless stories to tell. Many miners lost their lives in the mines around here, he explained. Their spirits are said to linger, haunting the places they once knew. Jack took me on a tour of the town's most haunted sites, sharing stories of ghostly apparitions and strange occurrences. One tale that stood out was about a miner named William, who died in a cave-in. His spirit is said to roam the town, looking for his lost companions. According to Jack, William's ghost had been seen wandering the streets at night, his lantern casting an eerie glow. As we walked through the town, Jack pointed out various buildings with haunted reputations. The Oatman Hotel, where I had seen the ghost, was just one of many. There was also the old saloon, where patrons had reported seeing phantom card players, and the abandoned mine shaft, where strange noises and lights had been observed. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As I lay in bed, I heard the faint sound of footsteps in the hallway. I got up to investigate, but the corridor was empty. Returning to my room, I noticed a cold spot near the window, where the air seemed to crackle with energy. It felt as though someone, or something, was standing right beside me. I spent several days in Oatman, each day uncovering more eerie tales and experiencing strange phenomena. Lights flickering, doors creaking open by themselves, and cold drafts that seemed to come from nowhere. The townsfolk were accustomed to these occurrences, often shrugging them off with a knowing smile. One evening, as I sat in a local saloon, I struck up a conversation with an old prospector named Bill. He was a grizzled man with a weathered face, and he had lived in Oatman for decades. Over a pint of beer, he shared his own encounters with the spirits of Oatman. "You see things out here that you can't explain," he said, taking a swig of his drink. "The past never really leaves this place." Bill recounted a particularly chilling story about a ghostly figure that appeared in his cabin one night. "I woke up to find a man standing at the foot of my bed," he recounted. "He looked like a miner from the old days. He didn't say anything, just stared at me for a long moment before fading away. I couldn't sleep for days after that." Bill's story sent shivers down my spine. It was clear that the spirits of Oatman were not just figments of the imagination. They were real, and their presence was felt by many. I decided to spend more time exploring the town, hoping to uncover more of its ghostly secrets. The following night, I joined a ghost tour led by a local guide named Sarah. The tour was a popular attraction, drawing both tourists and paranormal enthusiasts. Sarah was an enthusiastic storyteller, and she had a knack for bringing the haunted history of Oatman to life. As we walked through the darkened streets, Sarah recounted tales of haunted buildings and ghostly encounters. We visited the old schoolhouse, where the ghost of a young girl had been seen playing in the yard. We explored the abandoned jail, where prisoners had reported seeing shadowy figures in their cells. The highlight of the tour was the visit to the mine shaft, where the spirit of William was said to linger. As we descended into the dark, narrow tunnel, the air grew colder, and the sense of unease intensified. Sarah paused at a spot where the ground had caved in, marking the place of William's tragic death. "Many people have reported seeing William's ghost here," Sarah said, her voice echoing in the darkness. "They see his lantern flickering in the distance, and sometimes they hear his voice calling out for help." We stood in silence for a moment, listening to the stillness of the mine. Suddenly, I heard a faint whisper, like someone calling my name. The sound sent chills down my spine, and I felt a cold breeze brush past me. It was as if William's spirit was reaching out, trying to make contact. The tour ended at the Oatman Hotel, where I had first encountered the ghostly miner. As we stood in the dimly lit lobby, I felt the same chill I had felt on my first night. The air grew heavy, and the sense of being watched returned. Sarah concluded the tour with a final story about the hotel's haunted history. "This place has seen its share of tragedy," she said. "From miners who met untimely deaths to guests who never checked out. The spirits of Oatman are here to stay." As my time in Oatman came to an end, I reflected on the experiences I'd had. The town's haunted history had come alive in ways I could never have imagined. The spirits of Oatman, those restless souls of the past, had made their presence known. Driving away from Oatman, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see one of those ghostly figures watching me go. The town had left an indelible mark on me, a reminder that the past is never truly gone, and that sometimes the spirits of those who came before us still walk among us. Oatman had given me more than just ghost stories. It had given me a connection to history, a sense of the lives that had once thrived in this quirky little town. The ghosts of Oatman were not just echoes of the past. They were a part of the town's fabric, a reminder of the enduring spirit of those who had lived, worked, and died in this rugged corner of Arizona. As I continued my journey along Route 66, I carried with me the memories of Oatman and its spectral inhabitants. The experience had deepened my appreciation for the stories that make up our history and the spirits that keep those stories alive. The ghosts of Oatman, Arizona, would forever haunt my thoughts, a testament to the town's enduring mystery and charm. I've always been someone who seeks to escape the bustle of the city and find a bit of peace and tranquility. So when I found a small cabin for rent on a remote beach, I knew I had to go. It was the perfect place, far from everything and everyone, ideal for completely disconnecting. The journey was long and lonely, but when I arrived, the view was spectacular. The cabin was right in front of the sea, surrounded by palm trees and with a white sandy beach that stretched as far as the eye could see. There were no signs of other tourists, which thrilled me even more. The first day was perfect. I relaxed on the beach, read a book, and enjoyed the sound of the waves breaking on the shore. However, everything began to change the second night. I was sitting on the terrace, enjoying the sea breeze, when I noticed some lights in the distance. They looked like flashlights, moving among the dunes. At first I thought they were other tourists exploring the area, but during the day, the beach remained deserted. The next night, the lights appeared again, but this time they were closer. A chill ran down my spine. I tried not to give it importance and went to bed, but I had a hard time falling asleep. The next day, I found strange marks in the sand near my cabin, as if someone had been walking around during the night. As the days went by, the noises and lights became more frequent. I decided to investigate and followed the lights to a more remote part of the beach. I found traces of an abandoned campsite, an extinguished bonfire, food cans, and a broken tent. The most unsettling thing was the drawings in the sand, human figures with elongated heads and large eyes, arranged in strange patterns. I took some pictures of the drawings with my phone, hoping to make sense of them later. I felt an eerie presence around me, but I brushed it off as my imagination. I tried to remain calm, telling myself it was just a coincidence. That night, the lights came closer than ever. I heard voices whispering my name and footsteps around the cabin. I tried to call the police, but there was no phone signal. Suddenly, someone or something began pounding on the door violently. The bangs were forceful and constant. Terrified, I hid under the bed as the pounding intensified and the lights surrounded the cabin. I could hear whispers and malicious laughter. I decided to block the door with a chair, hoping it would keep whatever was out there from coming inside. The sounds continued for hours, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't understand what they wanted from me. In a moment of desperation, I decided to run. I opened the back door and ran towards the beach. The lights followed me, but I didn't see anyone behind them. The beach, which once seemed like a paradise, had now turned into a nightmare. I stumbled and fell several times, my fear driving me forward. At dawn, everything was silent. Exhausted, I returned to the cabin. There was no trace of the lights or the people who had harassed me during the night. However, I found a note on the door with my name written on it and a terrifying message. "We are watching you." Without wasting any time, I packed my things and left the cabin. While driving back home, I couldn't stop looking in the rearview mirror, fearing that something or someone was following me. I reached the city and told my friends about my experience, but no one believed me. They laughed it off as a wild story fueled by isolation and an overactive imagination. Back in the safety of my apartment, I tried to convince myself that it had all been a series of misunderstandings and coincidences. I even considered the possibility of local pranksters messing with tourists for fun. But the sense of unease wouldn't leave me. In the days that followed, I tried to return to my normal routine, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I went to bed, I felt as if someone was standing in the shadows, just out of sight. The sounds of the city, which used to comfort me, now seemed distant and hollow. One night, as I was trying to fall asleep, I heard a soft tapping on my window. My heart raced as I cautiously approached the window, pulling the curtain aside. There was nothing there, just the dark cityscape. I told myself it was the wind, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. I started researching the area where the cabin was located. I found old news articles about mysterious disappearances and strange occurrences on that very beach. Locals spoke of ghostly lights and figures that haunted the area. There were even stories about ancient rituals performed by indigenous tribes long ago. The more I read, the more I realized that my experience wasn't unique. Determined to find answers, I decided to visit the local library to dig deeper into the history of the beach. I found a dusty old book that mentioned the beach as a place where supernatural events were reported throughout the centuries. According to the book, the beach was once considered sacred ground, and disturbing it could awaken vengeful spirits. This revelation sent chills down my spine. Could it be that I had disturbed something ancient and malevolent during my stay? The thought was terrifying, but it also provided a possible explanation for what I had experienced. As the weeks passed, the haunting memories of the beach began to fade, but the sense of unease never completely left me. I avoided beaches and isolated places, preferring the safety of crowded, well-lit areas. I couldn't bring myself to delete the photos I had taken of the strange drawings in the sand. They served as a reminder of what I had gone through and a warning to never let my guard down. Even now, years later, I still get chills when I think about that lonely beach. I've shared my story with others, but most people dismiss it as fiction or exaggeration. Only a few have looked at me with understanding, sharing their own tales of inexplicable encounters. The experience changed me forever. It taught me that there are places in this world that we are not meant to disturb, places where the line between reality and the supernatural is blurred. And though I try to live my life without fear, there's a part of me that will always be haunted by the memory of that beach and the feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. My name is Alex, and what I'm about to share with you is a story of survival that took place in the most unexpected of settings, our office. It was a Friday afternoon when the weather report started coming in, predicting a severe snowstorm that would hit the city by evening. Our team, a tight-knit group of about 10 people, decided to stay late to finish a project. As the snow began to fall heavily, we realized we were not going to make it home and decided to stay in the office for the weekend. At first, the idea seemed novel and exciting. We gathered in the break room, ordered some pizzas, and set up makeshift beds with the cushions from the couches. The atmosphere was lighthearted as we laughed and shared stories, seeing this as an impromptu adventure. Little did we know that our lightheartedness would soon turn into a desperate fight for survival. By Saturday morning, the snowstorm had escalated beyond what anyone had expected. The snow piled up against the windows, and the wind howled like a banshee. Around noon, the power went out, plunging the office into darkness and cutting off our heating system. At first, we thought it was just a temporary outage, but as the hours passed, it became clear that this was something much more serious. Without electricity, we had no way to charge our phones or access the internet. We were completely cut off from the outside world. The temperature inside the office began to drop rapidly. We gathered all the blankets, coats, and any other warm clothing we could find, but it was barely enough to keep the chill at bay. We huddled together in one room to conserve body heat, trying to stay warm as the office turned into a freezer. We rationed the food and drinks we had, making sure everyone got a fair share. Our initial excitement had turned into grim determination. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and the freezing cold seeped into our bones. We knew we had to find ways to stay warm and survive the weekend. As night fell, the cold became unbearable. We tried to light a small fire in a metal trash can using paper and some wooden office supplies, hoping to generate a bit of heat without setting off the smoke alarms. It worked for a while, but the fire was small and didn't provide much warmth. We took turns watching it, making sure it didn't get out of control. On Sunday morning, we woke up to the sound of an explosion. The ground shook, and the air was filled with the acrid smell of smoke. Panic set in as we realized that a gas leak had caused an explosion in one of the offices down the hall. The blast had caused a fire that was quickly spreading, filling the office with thick black smoke and making it difficult to breathe. We covered our mouths and noses with whatever cloth we could find and tried to make our way to the emergency exits, but the smoke was thick and disorienting. The heat from the fire was intense, and we could feel it burning through the walls. The once familiar office now felt like a death trap, with flames licking at the doors and smoke reducing our visibility to near zero. In the chaos, we got separated. I was with a few of my colleagues, and we decided to head towards a back stairwell that we rarely used, hoping it would lead us to safety. As we stumbled through the smoke-filled corridors, we could hear the fire alarms blaring and the sounds of the building groaning under the stress of the fire. We finally reached the stairwell and began our descent. The metal steps were icy cold under our feet, and the darkness was almost complete. Our only light came from the occasional flicker of the fire through the smoke. We moved as quickly as we could, knowing that staying in the building was no longer an option. On the third floor, we encountered a door that was blocked by debris. We had no choice but to clear it, using what little strength we had left. It felt like an eternity, but we managed to make enough space to squeeze through. The air in the stairwell was slightly clearer, but the cold was even more biting. As we reached the ground floor, we realized that the main exits were blocked by the fire. We were trapped. In our desperation, we started searching for another way out and stumbled upon a service door hidden behind some old storage boxes. None of us had ever noticed it before, but it was our last hope. We forced the door open and were greeted by a blast of freezing air. It led to a narrow maintenance tunnel that ran underneath the building. The tunnel was cramped and filled with cobwebs, but it provided a path to the outside. We crawled through it, shivering and exhausted, but driven by the need to escape. After what felt like hours, we finally emerged into the blinding white of the snowstorm. The cold was even more intense outside, but at least we were away from the fire. We stumbled through the snow, our bodies numb, until we found a small, abandoned shed. It offered little protection, but it was better than nothing. Inside the shed, we found an old, rusty radio. With our last bit of strength, we managed to get it working and sent out a distress signal. Hours passed before we heard the sound of snowplows and saw the flashing lights of emergency vehicles. The rescue team found us and brought us to safety. The experience left us deeply shaken. The office, once a place of routine and normalcy, had turned into a nightmarish prison. The trauma of being trapped, the cold, the fire, and the fear of not making it out alive stayed with us. We all struggled with the memories of those harrowing days, finding it difficult to return to work and face the place that had almost become our tomb. We received counseling and support from our company, but the bond we shared as survivors was the strongest comfort. We had faced a terrifying ordeal together and come out alive. The experience changed us all, making us more aware of the fragility of life and the importance of preparedness. Today, I can still feel the cold seeping into my bones when I think about that weekend. I still hear the echoes of the explosion and see the faces of my colleagues pale with fear, but I also remember our determination, our will to survive, and the strength we found in each other. The office is different now, with new safety measures and emergency protocols in place. But the memory of those days lingers, a stark reminder of how quickly everything can change and how important it is to be prepared for the unexpected. Living alone in a small apartment, I often found myself gazing out the window, seeking a connection to the world outside. My favorite pastime was watching the comings and goings of my neighbors, particularly the man who lived directly across the street. He was tall, with a stern face and an air of mystery that intrigued me. Every night, without fail, He would stand at his window, staring out into the darkness. At first, I thought he was just a night owl, but as the weeks passed, I noticed a pattern. He always appeared at the same time, 10 p.m. sharp, and stood there for exactly 1 hour. It was as if he were waiting for something, or someone. One night, unable to resist my curiosity, I decided to stay up and watch him. As the clock struck 10, he appeared, his silhouette stark against the dim light of his apartment. He stood motionless, his eyes seemingly fixed on my window. A chill ran down my spine. I grabbed my binoculars, a relic from my birdwatching phase, and focused on his window. What I saw made my heart race. He wasn't just standing there. He was reenacting something. His movements were deliberate, almost ritualistic. He held an object in his hand, mimicking a stabbing motion. Then he paused, his gaze piercing through the glass, directly at me. I dropped the binoculars, my hands shaking. Had he seen me? I quickly turned off my lights and retreated to the safety of my bed, pulling the covers over my head like a child hiding from the boogeyman. The next morning, I convinced myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe he was rehearsing for a play or something. But the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. I decided to investigate further. Days turned into weeks, and I kept a meticulous log of his activities. Each night, the same routine. It was like watching a horror movie on repeat. I noticed details I had missed before. The red stains on his shirt, the eerie smile on his face as he mimicked the stabbing motion. It was unsettling, to say the least. One night, curiosity got the better of me. I left my apartment and made my way across the street, my heart pounding with each step. His building was old, with creaky floors and dimly lit hallways. I found his apartment easily enough and pressed my ear to the door. Silence. Gathering my courage, I knocked. There was no answer. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. I tried the handle, and to my surprise, it turned. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, empty apartment. I stepped inside, my heart in my throat. The place was sparsely furnished, with an air of neglect. In the living room, I found the window he always stood at. The view was eerily similar to mine, a mirror image of my own apartment. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. A notebook on the coffee table. I picked it up and flipped through the pages. My blood ran cold. It was a detailed journal, filled with notes about me, my name, my habits, even my favorite foods. He had been watching me just as I had been watching him. Before I could process this horrifying revelation, I heard footsteps. Panic set in, and I quickly hid behind the couch. The footsteps grew louder, and soon he was standing in the doorway, his back to me. He moved to the window, resuming his nightly ritual, completely unaware of my presence. I watched, frozen in place, as he went through his usual motions. The red stains on his shirt, the sinister smile. It all made sense now. He was recreating the murders he had committed, using me as his unwitting audience. My mind raced, trying to come up with a plan to escape without being noticed. As he turned away from the window, I seized the moment. I crept towards the door, my movements slow and deliberate. Just as I reached the handle, he spoke. "You should have stayed in your apartment." His voice was calm, almost amused. I turned to face him, my heart pounding in my chest. He stood there, a knife in his hand, his eyes cold and devoid of emotion. "What do you want from me?" I stammered, backing away. He tilted his head, regarding me with a chilling curiosity. "You've been watching me, haven't you? Did you enjoy the show?" I swallowed hard, my mind racing. I don't know what you're talking about." He laughed, a low, sinister sound that sent shivers down my spine. Don't lie to me. I've seen you with your binoculars. You're just as guilty as I am. Desperation surged through me. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to intrude. I'll leave, and I won't say a word to anyone. He took a step closer, the knife glinting in the dim light. It's too late for that. You're part of this now. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my ears. I burst out of the apartment and raced down the hallway, not daring to look back. My mind was a blur of fear and adrenaline as I fled the building and made my way back to my apartment. Once inside, I locked the door and collapsed against it, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I had to do something, call the police, get help, anything. But as I reached for the phone, a realization hit me. He knew where I lived. He had been watching me for weeks. If I went to the police, he would come after me. And who would believe my story? A lonely woman spying on her neighbor, imagining things. Days passed in a haze of fear and paranoia. I barely left my apartment, keeping the lights off and the curtains drawn. Every creak and rustle made me jump, my mind conjuring images of him lurking outside, waiting for the right moment to strike. I knew I couldn't live like this forever. I had to take action, to find a way to expose him without putting myself in further danger. I spent hours online researching the recent murders in the area, looking for anything that might connect him to the crimes. My breakthrough came when I found an old news article about a string of unsolved murders. The victims all lived in the same neighborhood, and each was killed in their home. The descriptions of the killer's methods matched what I had seen him reenacting in his window. It was him, no doubt about it. Armed with this information, I contacted a local reporter known for his investigative work. I explained my situation, leaving out my own voyeuristic tendencies, and provided the evidence I had gathered. He agreed to look into it, promising to keep me informed. The waiting was excruciating. Every night I watched him from my darkened apartment, praying that the reporter would find something concrete. Then one evening, my phone buzzed with a message. It was the reporter. "Meet me tomorrow at noon. I have something." The next day, I ventured out for the first time in weeks, my heart heavy with anticipation and fear. I met the reporter at a small cafe, and he wasted no time getting to the point. "You were right," he said, sliding a folder across the table. "Your neighbor is the prime suspect in a series of murders. The police have been looking for him for months." I glanced through the documents, my hands trembling. It was all there. Photos, witness statements, forensic evidence. "What do we do now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "We need to go to the police with this," he replied. "But we have to be careful. If he finds out we're onto him, it could be dangerous." That night, the reporter and I went to the police station, handing over the evidence. The officers took our statements and assured us they would act swiftly. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. The following evening, I watched from my window as unmarked police cars surrounded my neighbor's building. Officers moved in, their silhouettes barely visible in the darkness. Minutes later, they emerged with him in handcuffs. His expression was one of cold indifference, but when he glanced in my direction, our eyes met. His look was one of quiet menace, promising retribution. In the days that followed, the police uncovered more evidence linking him to the murders. The community was in shock, but I felt a sense of relief knowing he was behind bars. The nightmare was over, or so I thought. A week later, I received an envelope in the mail. Inside was a single photograph, me, taken from his window, with a message scrawled on the back. "I'm always watching." Fear gripped me once more. He might be in prison, but his influence lingered. My life had been irrevocably changed by the man in the window across the street. I knew I could never let my guard down, never assume I was safe. I installed new locks, security cameras, and even moved to a new apartment. But every night, As I stood by my window, I couldn't help but look across the street, half expecting to see him standing there, watching me. The fear was always there, lurking in the shadows, a constant reminder of the danger that once loomed so close. And so, I live my life in perpetual vigilance, knowing that some nightmares never truly end. They just fade into the background, waiting for the right moment to resurface. Overtoun Bridge, located near Dumbarton, Scotland, is a picturesque structure spanning a deep gorge. But despite its serene appearance, the bridge is known for a chilling phenomenon, dogs leaping to their deaths for no apparent reason. This macabre legend has earned it the nickname the Dog Suet Bridge. Intrigued by the stories, I decided to visit and uncover the truth behind the eerie occurrences. I arrived at Overtoun Bridge on a misty morning, the fog hanging low over the landscape. The bridge itself was a beautiful example of 19th century architecture, its stone arches gracefully spanning the gorge below. But the peaceful setting belied the dark reputation that had drawn me here. As I walked across the bridge, I couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. The air was heavy, and the silence was broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. I leaned over the edge, peering into the dense undergrowth far below. It was easy to see how a fall from such a height could be fatal. I met with a local historian named Margaret, who had agreed to show me around and share the history of the bridge. She was an elderly woman with a sharp mind and a wealth of knowledge about the area. Overtoun Bridge was built in 1895, she explained. But it's not just the architecture that makes it famous. For decades, people have reported dogs jumping from this bridge, often to their deaths. It's a tragic mystery that has baffled experts and locals alike. Margaret led me to the site of many of these tragic incidents. As we stood there, she recounted some of the most disturbing stories. Dogs will suddenly become agitated, running towards the edge and leaping off without hesitation. It's as if they're drawn by some unseen force. I shuddered at the thought. Has anyone ever found an explanation? There are many theories, Margaret replied. Some believe it's due to the scent of mink in the underbrush, which drives the dogs into a frenzy. Others think it's related to the unique acoustics of the bridge, which might confuse the animals. And then there are those who believe it's something more sinister. Margaret's mention of sinister forces piqued my interest. What do you mean? There's a legend, she said, lowering her voice, that Overtoun Bridge is a thin place, a location where the veil between our world and the spirit world is thinner. Some say the dogs are sensing spirits or being influenced by otherworldly presences. That evening, I decided to stay in a nearby bed and breakfast, hoping to gather more insights from the locals. Over dinner, I struck up a conversation with the owner, a middle-aged man named David. Everyone around here knows about the bridge, David said, shaking his head. I've heard all sorts of stories. Some say they've seen ghostly figures near the bridge. Others have felt a sudden chill or heard whispers in the wind. I pressed him for more details, and he shared a personal experience. A few years ago, my wife and I were walking our dog near the bridge. Our dog, Max, was always well behaved, but that day he started acting strangely. He pulled on the leash, barking and growling at something we couldn't see. It was as if he was in a trance. We had to drag him away from the edge. I've never seen him act like that before or since. David's story added a new layer to the mystery. I decided to visit the bridge again at night, hoping to experience something for myself. Armed with a flashlight and a sense of trepidation, I made my way back to Overtoun Bridge under the cover of darkness. The bridge was eerily quiet, the only sound the distant hoot of an owl. As I walked across, the flashlight beam cut through the mist, casting long shadows on the stone walls. I reached the center of the bridge and stopped, listening to the silence. Suddenly, I felt a chill run down my spine. The air grew colder, and I sensed a presence behind me. I turned, but there was no one there. My heart pounded as I scanned the area with the flashlight. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure, a pale, ghostly shape standing at the edge of the bridge. I froze, unable to move. The figure seemed to beckon, its form wavering in the mist. I felt a strange compulsion to move closer, but I fought the urge. Instead, I called out, "Who are you?" The figure remained silent, slowly fading into the fog. The chill in the air dissipated, leaving me shaken but determined to find answers. I spent the rest of the night researching in my room, trying to piece together the puzzle of Overtoun Bridge. In the following days, I spoke with more locals and experts, gathering accounts of strange phenomena and tragic events. The stories were consistent: dogs acting out of character, ghostly sightings, and an overwhelming sense of unease. Despite the many theories, there was no definitive explanation. The bridge's history, combined with the inexplicable behavior of the dogs, suggested something more than mere coincidence. Whether it was a natural phenomenon or a supernatural presence, Overtoun Bridge remained a place of mystery and tragedy. As I left Scotland, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had only scratched the surface of the bridge's secrets. The ghostly figure and the eerie experiences had left a lasting impression. Overtoun Bridge was more than just a tragic location. It was a place where the past and present intertwined, a reminder that some mysteries might never be fully understood. My journey along Route 66 had taken me to many haunted and historic places, but the legend of Overtoun Bridge was one that would stay with me forever. It was a haunting tale of unexplained phenomena, a story that blended history, tragedy, and the supernatural in a way that left me both fascinated and deeply unsettled. Hi, my name is Laura, and I'm going to tell you the most terrifying story of my life. It all began as a simple weekend getaway with my friends. After weeks of work and stress, we decided to rent a cabin in the mountains, far away from the city and our worries. The idea was to relax, disconnect, and enjoy nature. We had no idea that this weekend would change our lives forever. We arrived at the cabin on a Friday afternoon. The place was beautiful, surrounded by trees and with an impressive view of the mountains. The cabin itself was rustic but cozy, with a fireplace that promised warm and comfortable nights. After unpacking, we sat around the fire, laughing and telling stories. The storm started to rage outside, but we weren't worried. We were together and safe. However, the tranquility didn't last long. The next morning, we realized that a landslide had blocked the only way out. The storm had been more intense than we thought, and now we were trapped. We tried using our phones, but there was no signal. Without electricity, we couldn't use the emergency radio in the cabin either. We decided to wait for the weather to improve and for the road to clear. That night, as we sat around the fireplace, we started hearing strange noises. At first, we thought they were animals outside, but the sounds seemed to come from inside the cabin. Soft footsteps, doors closing, and creaks in the floorboards. The tension began to rise, but we tried to stay calm. "It must be the wind," one of my friends said, although we all knew it wasn't true. On the third night, things took a turn for the worse. One of my friends, Carlos, had been very restless since we arrived. That night, he disappeared. At first, we thought he had gone out to look for help, but his belongings were still in the cabin. We searched everywhere, shouting his name, but there was no response. Desperation began to take hold of us. Then, one of my friends, Marta, found something in the basement. It was a small hidden room filled with personal items and canned food. It looked like someone had been living there. On the wall, there were newspaper clippings about disappearances in the area and photos of people we had never seen before. Among the photos, there was one of Carlos. Suddenly, we felt a presence behind us. We turned around, and there was a man, dirty and disheveled, with a look of madness in his eyes. He shouted at us to get out of his house, that we had invaded his sanctuary. At that moment, everything became chaotic. We ran out of the basement, trying to block the door behind us. But the man was strong and managed to break through. We fought for our lives that night. We used everything we could find as weapons, trying to keep the man away. Finally, we managed to trap him in the basement and block the door, but we knew we weren't safe. The storm continued, and we were trapped with a madman below us. We spent the night awake, listening for any sound that indicated the man had escaped. At dawn, the storm began to subside, and we could hear helicopters in the distance. Rescuers had finally arrived. They found us in a state of shock, injured and terrified. We never saw Carlos again. The man in the basement was arrested, but never revealed what had happened to our friend. The authorities found human remains in the basement, but they couldn't identify who they belonged to. The experience left us with deep scars and a question we will never be able to answer. What really happened in that cabin? Since that day, every time I think of that getaway, I feel a chill run down my spine. What started as a weekend of fun turned into a true nightmare. I have learned to be more cautious and not to underestimate the dangers that can hide in seemingly peaceful places. That cabin, which was once a cozy refuge, now only exists in my nightmares. We tried to continue our lives as normally as possible after that, but the events of that weekend haunted us. Marta moved to a different city, trying to escape the memories. Javier, another friend who was with us, started attending therapy to deal with the trauma. As for me, I couldn't step into a cabin or even think about going to the mountains without feeling a deep sense of dread. Every noise in my house, every creak in the floorboards, took me back to that night. I became hyper-aware of my surroundings, always expecting to see that madman standing behind me. My dreams were plagued with images of Carlos, his face appearing in dark corners and his voice calling out for help. I often woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. The authorities investigated the cabin thoroughly. They discovered that the man living in the basement had been presumed dead years ago in a similar storm. He had survived by hiding in the cabin, scavenging food and supplies from unsuspecting visitors. His mental state had deteriorated over time, leading him to believe that anyone who came near the cabin was an intruder. Despite knowing the facts, the fear didn't subside. We had faced a real-life horror, and the scars were not just physical. They were embedded deep within our psyche. We tried to support each other, but the bond we once shared was now tainted by the traumatic experience. Our conversations, once filled with laughter and joy, were now strained and guarded. Months passed, and I decided to write about our experience as a form of therapy. I wanted to share our story, to warn others about the dangers that could lurk in the most unexpected places. As I wrote, I relived every moment, every sound, every fear. It was a painful process, but it also brought a sense of release. I realized that by facing my fears head-on, I could begin to heal. The story gained attention, and soon I was contacted by journalists and TV shows wanting to hear more about our ordeal. I hesitated at first, but then I saw it as an opportunity to spread awareness. I wanted people to be cautious, to be aware of their surroundings, and to understand that danger could strike at any moment. Through sharing our story, I connected with others who had faced similar traumas. Their stories were different, but the fear and pain were the same. We formed a support group, helping each other navigate the long road to recovery. Slowly, I began to reclaim parts of my life that I had lost to fear. I visited the mountains again, this time with a group of survivors from the support group. We stayed in a well-populated area, ensuring we were never alone. It was a small step, but it marked the beginning of my journey to overcome the terror that had gripped my life. The cabin in the mountains will always be a part of my story, a chapter filled with horror and pain, but it also serves as a reminder of my resilience and the strength I found within myself and my friends. We survived, and through our survival, we found a way to move forward, scarred but stronger. Today, I live with a new awareness and appreciation for life. I understand the fragility of our existence and the importance of cherishing every moment. The experience in that cabin taught me the value of friendship, the power of resilience, and the need for caution. It's a part of me now, shaping who I am and how I live. And while the nightmares may never fully disappear, I know I have the strength to face them, just as I faced that horrifying weekend in the mountains. Friends and I decided to take a boat trip to explore a deserted island near the coast. We had talked about it for months, imagining the thrill of setting foot on an untouched piece of land, far from the noise and chaos of our daily lives. The island, rumored to be a hidden gem with its pristine beaches and lush greenery, was the perfect destination for our adventurous spirits. On a bright Saturday morning, we set sail, the boat cutting through the calm, azure waters with ease. Laughter and excited chatter filled the air as we navigated toward our destination, eager for a day of exploration and fun. The day unfolded just as we had hoped. We swam in the crystal-clear waters, lounged on the soft sands, and ventured into the thick forest that covered much of the island. The sun blazed overhead, casting a golden hue over everything. It was idyllic, a paradise that seemed to exist just for us. As the day wore on, we gathered driftwood and built a small fire, planning to roast marshmallows and tell stories as the sun set. But as evening approached, the weather took an unexpected turn. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, and the wind picked up, ruffling the calm surface of the sea. Before we could react, a violent storm descended upon us. The sky turned black, lightning cracked, and thunder roared. The waves grew menacing, and our boat, anchored just off the shore, was tossed about like a toy. Realizing we couldn't risk returning to the mainland in such conditions, we decided to seek refuge on the island. The storm raged through the night, pinning us to the beach. We huddled together, drenched and shivering, as rain pelted down and the wind howled around us. It was a stark contrast to the sunny paradise we had enjoyed just hours earlier. Exhausted and cold, we finally managed to find a semblance of shelter in the form of a dense thicket of trees. As the first light of dawn crept through the storm clouds, we surveyed our situation. The storm had passed, but our boat was badly damaged, and it was clear we were stranded. Determined to make the best of it, we decided to explore the island further, hoping to find resources that could help us repair the boat or signal for help. While exploring, we stumbled upon an old, dilapidated shack hidden among the trees. It was a curious sight, seemingly abandoned yet relatively intact. The door creaked ominously as we pushed it open, revealing a cluttered interior. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light that penetrated the grimy windows. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay. Among the scattered debris, I caught sight of a weathered diary lying on a rickety table. Curiosity piqued. I picked up the diary and began to read aloud. The diary belonged to a man named Andrew, who had been shipwrecked on the island many years ago. Andrew's entries started with detailed accounts of his initial efforts to survive, finding food, fresh water, and building a shelter. But as the days turned into weeks, his writings took a darker turn. He described seeing shadowy figures moving between the trees, hearing disembodied voices whispering his name, and finding strange symbols etched into the sand. Andrew wrote of his growing paranoia convinced that something was stalking him on the island. We exchanged uneasy glances as I read. The diary's descriptions resonated with our own experiences. The fleeting shadows, the inexplicable whispers, and the ominous marks we had seen on the beach the previous night. A sense of dread settled over us, a realization that we might not be as alone as we had thought. As night fell, the island's eerie ambiance intensified. The once peaceful sounds of nature now seemed sinister. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig set our nerves on edge. We gathered around the fire we had built earlier, the flickering flames casting long, dancing shadows. We tried to brush off our fear with nervous laughter and light-hearted banter, but the tension was palpable. In the middle of the night, we were jolted awake by a blood-curdling scream. It was Mark, one of our friends, and the sound came from deeper within the forest. Grabbing our flashlights, we rushed toward the source of the scream, our hearts pounding with fear. We found nothing but a trail of blood and disturbed sand leading away from our camp. Mark was gone. Panic set in as we followed the trail, the beam of our flashlights cutting through the oppressive darkness. The path led us to the entrance of a cave, its mouth gaping like a black hole. The air inside was cold and damp, and the walls were slick with moisture. With trepidation, we entered, our footsteps echoing in the confined space. The cave was a labyrinth of narrow passages and chambers. As we ventured deeper, we found Mark's belongings, his backpack, flashlight, and even his shoes scattered across the floor. The walls were covered in the same strange symbols Andrew had described in his diary. A sense of dread filled us as we realized that these markings were not natural. They were a warning, a message left by something that inhabited the island. Suddenly, a guttural growl echoed through the cave, freezing us in our tracks. We shone our flashlights around but saw nothing. The growl came again, closer this time. We turned and ran, stumbling over rocks and slipping on the wet ground. The sense of being hunted was overwhelming. Emerging from the cave, we didn't stop running until we reached the relative safety of our camp. Our breaths came in ragged gasps, and our minds were filled with terror. We knew we had to get off the island, but the storm had damaged our boat, and we had no way to signal for help. Desperation led us to scavenge the island for anything that could help us repair the boat. As we worked, we were constantly looking over our shoulders, feeling the eyes of the island's unseen inhabitant upon us. Time seemed to stretch, each minute a torment as we raced against an unknown enemy. On the third day, just as we were losing hope, a fishing boat appeared on the horizon. I waved frantically, shouting at the top of my lungs. The boat altered its course and approached the island. The fishermen aboard were skeptical of my frantic tale, but seeing my disheveled state, they agreed to take me aboard. I was the only one who made it off the island. My friends were never found. Back on the mainland, my story was met with disbelief. The authorities conducted a search but found no evidence of the mysterious creature or the strange symbols. The island was deemed a place of tragic accidents and left alone. My life was never the same. I was haunted by the memories of my friends' screams and the feeling of being hunted. The island remained a mystery, its secrets buried in the sands and shadows. Despite surviving, I knew I would never truly escape the island's grip. The nightmares, the sense of dread, they followed me, a constant reminder of the terror that lurked just beyond the reach of the known world.
My name is Daniel Williams, and I worked as a night security guard in an old office building downtown. It was my first day on the job, and I had heard stories about how strange the night shift could be, but I never imagined what I was about to experience. I arrived at the building at 10 p.m. The place had an eerie atmosphere, with its flickering lights and long, empty hallways. Upon entering, the head of security, an older man named Mr. Roberts, greeted me with a serious expression. "Daniel, there are some rules you need to follow strictly during your shift," he said, handing me a sheet of paper. "Do not ignore them for any reason." I thought it was a joke or some sort of tradition for newcomers, but his tone made it clear he was serious. I glanced at the sheet while Mr. Roberts continued talking. "These rules aren't there for no reason. If you want to survive the night, follow them to the letter." The rules were as follows. 1. Never look directly at the security cameras between 12 o'clock a.m. and 3 o'clock a.m. 2. If you hear a whisper, do not respond or try to find the source of the sound. 3. Always carry a flashlight and never rely on the building's lights. 4. If you encounter someone who shouldn't be in the building, do not speak to them or try to approach them. Simply report it to the head of security. 5. At 2:33 a.m., you must be in the control room, lock the door, and do not leave until the clock strikes 3 o'clock a.m. The list went on, but those were the most important. I couldn't believe what I was reading. Whispers? People who shouldn't be there? It all seemed like something out of a horror story. But Mr. Roberts wasn't smiling. He was completely serious. "Is everything clear?" he asked. I nodded, even though I had many questions. I decided to follow the rules and not take any chances. The night started quietly. I did my initial rounds without any issues, checking each floor and making sure everything was in order. The building was large, with many offices and seemingly endless hallways. Shadows seemed to move with every step I took, but I told myself it was just my imagination. At midnight, things started to get strange. While checking the security cameras, I noticed one of them, the one facing the basement, showed a dark figure moving. I remembered the first rule and quickly looked away. My heart was pounding, but I carried on. At 1 o'clock a.m., I heard a whisper. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. I remembered the second rule and stood still, holding my breath. The whisper grew louder, as if someone was right behind me. I closed my eyes and tried to focus on my breathing. Finally, the whisper faded. I felt relieved, but the tension didn't leave me. At 2:33 a.m., as instructed, I made my way to the control room and locked the door. I sat down and waited. The cameras showed empty hallways, but something felt off. At 2:45 a.m., the camera on the 7th floor showed a woman with long black hair, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, walking slowly. A chill ran down my spine. Her eyes were empty, like two black voids. I remembered the rule about not looking directly at the cameras and turned away, but the image was burned into my mind. Finally, the clock struck 3 o'clock a.m. I left the control room and continued my rounds. Nothing else seemed out of the ordinary, but the feeling of being watched never left me. When my shift ended at 6 o'clock a.m., I met Mr. Roberts at the entrance. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Yeah, everything's fine," I lied, still haunted by the woman on the camera. "Good. Remember, follow the rules and you'll be safe." I nodded and left, wanting to forget about that night, but I knew I couldn't. The experience had left a mark on me, and although I continued working there, I always did so with a mix of fear and respect for the rules. I knew my life depended on them. The next few nights were uneventful, though I never let my guard down. I followed the rules meticulously, avoiding the cameras during the forbidden hours, ignoring any whispers, and ensuring I was locked in the control room at the specified time. My nerves were constantly on edge, but I was starting to get used to the routine. One night, about a week into the job, things took a turn for the worse. It was around 1:15 a.m. when I heard it again. A whisper, but this time it was louder, more insistent. I froze, remembering the second rule. My heart pounded as the whisper grew into a murmur, then a low chant. It felt as if the sound was enveloping me, surrounding me from all sides. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out. I fumbled for my flashlight, cursing under my breath. The building plunged into darkness, and the only sound was the persistent whisper. I managed to turn on my flashlight and directed its beam down the hallway, but it did little to cut through the oppressive darkness. I decided to head to the control room early. As I walked, I felt a presence behind me, but I didn't dare turn around. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second I saw a shadow dart across the wall. I quickened my pace, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I reached the control room, locked the door, and slumped into the chair, trying to calm myself. The cameras showed the usual empty hallways, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. At 2:33 a.m., the whispering became a cacophony of voices, each one more desperate than the last. The camera on the 7th floor flickered again. The woman was back, but this time she wasn't alone. Shadows moved behind her, indistinct shapes that seemed to pulse and writhe. I looked away, heart pounding. The whispering grew louder, now a chorus of voices. The door to the control room rattled, as if someone was trying to force it open. I checked the clock. 2:50 a.m. 10 more minutes. I held my breath, praying the door would hold. At 3:00 a.m., the whispering stopped abruptly. I unlocked the door and stepped out, flashlight ready. The hallway was empty, but the air was thick with tension. I finished my rounds, each step feeling like it took an eternity. As my shift ended, I met Mr. Roberts at the entrance. "Rough night?" he asked, noticing my pale face. "You could say that," I replied, my voice shaking. "Remember, the rules are there for a reason. Don't ever forget that." I nodded, too exhausted to argue or ask questions. As I left, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, something that was growing bolder with each passing night. The next night, I arrived at the building with a sense of dread. I knew I had to follow the rules, but a part of me feared it wouldn't be enough. The memory of the woman's empty eyes and the relentless whispering haunted me. As I began my rounds, I noticed something strange. The air felt heavier, and there was an unsettling stillness in the building. I reached the 3rd floor when I saw it. An open door to an office that should have been locked. My flashlight revealed an empty room, but the air inside felt colder, almost frigid. Ignoring the growing sense of dread, I closed the door and continued my patrol. At 12:45 a.m., I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but there was no one there. The whispering started again, louder than ever. I made my way to the control room, heart racing. Locking the door, I sat down and tried to steady my breathing. The cameras showed nothing unusual, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. At 2:33 a.m., the whispering became a cacophony of voices, each one more desperate than the last. The camera on the 7th floor flickered again. The woman was back, but this time she wasn't alone. Shadows moved behind her, indistinct shapes that seemed to pulse and writhe. I looked away, heart pounding. The whispering grew louder, now a chorus of voices. The door to the control room rattled, as if someone was trying to force it open. I checked the clock. 2:50 a.m. 10 more minutes. I held my breath, praying the door would hold. At 3 o'clock a.m., the whispering stopped abruptly. I unlocked the door and stepped out, flashlight ready. The hallway was empty, but the air was thick with tension. I finished my rounds, each step feeling like it took an eternity. As my shift ended, I met Mr. Roberts at the entrance. "Daniel, there's something you need to know," he said, his voice more serious than ever. "What is it?" I asked, my anxiety spiking. "There's a door in the basement," he began. "It's always been there, but it's sealed off. Recently, the seal has been weakening. If it opens, it could let out whatever's been trapped inside." My blood ran cold. "What do we do?" "We need to reinforce the seal," he said. "Tonight, after your shift, I need you to help me." I agreed, knowing I had no choice. That night, as I made my rounds, I felt a growing sense of dread. The whispering was louder than ever, and the shadows seemed to close in around me. I made it to the control room at 2:33 a.m., locked the door, and waited. At 2:45 a.m., the woman appeared again, but this time she was closer. Her eyes seemed to bore into mine through the camera. I quickly looked away, heart pounding. The whispering grew louder, now a chorus of voices. The door to the control room rattled violently, as if someone, or something, was trying to break in. I checked the clock, 2:50 a.m., just 10 more minutes. I closed my eyes, focusing on the rules. At 3 o'clock a.m., the whispering stopped abruptly. I unlocked the door and stepped out, flashlight in hand. The hallway was empty, but the air felt heavier, almost oppressive. I finished my rounds, each step feeling like it took an eternity. When my shift ended, Mr. Roberts was waiting for me. "Are you ready?" he asked. I nodded, fear gripping my heart. Together we made our way to the basement. The air grew colder, and the whispering returned, louder than ever. We reached the door, its seal glowing faintly. "Hold the flashlight," Mr. Roberts instructed, pulling out a set of tools. He worked quickly, reinforcing the seal. The whispering grew louder, almost deafening. "Hurry!" I urged, my voice barely audible over the noise. Finally, Mr. Roberts finished. The seal glowed brightly, and the whispering stopped. The seal glowed brightly, and the whispering stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was almost as unsettling as the noise had been. We both stood there, breathing heavily, trying to process what had just happened. "Is it over?" I asked, barely able to believe what we had just witnessed. "For now," Mr. Roberts replied, wiping sweat from his brow. "We've reinforced the seal, but we need to remain vigilant. This isn't a permanent solution." I nodded, still gripping the flashlight tightly. As we made our way back upstairs, the oppressive feeling began to lift slightly. The building felt a little less sinister, but I knew better than to let my guard down. "Thank you, Daniel," Mr. Roberts said as we reached the ground floor. "You did well tonight. Just remember to keep following the rules." "I will," I promised, feeling a sense of camaraderie with the older man. "We'll get through this." With that, I left the building, the dawn light beginning to break over the city. I couldn't wait to get home and collapse into bed, but the events of the night kept replaying in my mind. As exhausted as I was, sleep didn't come easily. Over the next few nights, the building seemed quieter. The whispering was still present, but it was faint, almost distant. The shadows seemed less threatening. I hoped that reinforcing the seal had made a lasting impact. However, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still lurking, waiting for the right moment to strike. One night, about a week later, I arrived at the building to find Mr. Roberts waiting for me at the entrance. His expression was grave, and I knew immediately that something was wrong. "Daniel, we need to talk," he said, motioning for me to follow him inside. We made our way to the control room, where he closed the door behind us and sat down, gesturing for me to do the same. "I've been doing some research," he began, pulling out a stack of old documents. "This building has a long and dark history. It was built on the site of an old asylum, and many of the patients who lived here never left." My heart sank as I looked through the documents. Newspaper clippings, old photographs, and reports of strange occurrences all pointed to one thing. The spirits of the asylum's patients were still here, and they were growing stronger. "The seal we reinforced in the basement was meant to contain the darkest of these spirits," Mr. Roberts continued. "But it's only a temporary fix. We need to find a way to permanently put them to rest." "How do we do that?" I asked, feeling a mix of fear and determination. "There's a ritual," he said, showing me an old tattered book. "It's risky, but it might be our only chance. We need to perform it in the basement, at the site of the seal." I agreed, knowing that this might be our only chance to stop the haunting once and for all. We spent the next few nights preparing, gathering the necessary materials and memorizing the steps of the ritual. The night of the ritual, the building felt more oppressive than ever. The whispering was louder, and the shadows seemed to move with purpose. As we made our way to the basement, the air grew colder, and I felt a chill run down my spine. We reached the door with the glowing seal. Mr. Roberts set up the materials for the ritual, and we began to chant the incantations from the book. The air grew colder still, and the whispering became a deafening roar. Suddenly, the seal began to crack, and a dark, shapeless figure emerged from the door. Its eyes were empty voids, and it exuded a malevolent presence. My heart pounded in my chest as Mr. Roberts and I continued to chant, our voices barely audible over the cacophony. The figure lunged at us, but an invisible barrier held it back. The seal glowed brighter as our chanting intensified. With a final, desperate effort, we completed the ritual, and the figure let out a blood-curdling scream before dissolving into nothingness. The whispering stopped, and the air grew noticeably warmer. The oppressive feeling that had permeated the building for so long seemed to lift, replaced by a strange sense of peace. Mr. Roberts and I stood there in stunned silence, catching our breath. The seal on the door glowed one last time before fading back to normal, leaving no trace of the dark presence that had emerged. "Is it over?" I asked, barely able to believe what we had just witnessed. "I think so," Mr. Roberts replied, his voice tinged with both relief and exhaustion. "The ritual seems to have worked. The spirits should be at rest now." We cleaned up the remnants of the ritual and made our way back upstairs. The building felt different, lighter somehow. As we exited the building, the first rays of dawn were breaking over the city. "Thank you, Daniel," Mr. Roberts said as we reached the entrance. "We couldn't have done this without you." "It was a team effort," I replied, feeling a sense of camaraderie with the older man. "Let's hope this is the end of it." With that, I left the building, finally able to breathe a sigh of relief. The events of the past few weeks had left a mark on me, but I felt stronger, knowing I had faced the unknown and survived. As I walked home, I couldn't help but glance back at the building one last time. It stood there, silent and still, a reminder of the dark secrets it once held. But for the first time, I felt that those secrets were finally laid to rest. And so, my fear seekers, the tale of the night shift rules comes to an end. Daniel and Mr. Roberts faced the darkness and emerged victorious. But remember, not all haunted places are as forgiving. Some rules are meant to be followed, no matter how strange they seem. Until next time, stay vigilant and keep your fears close. You never know when you might need them.
My name is David, and the story I'm about to tell you is about a seemingly simple hiking trip that turned into a nightmare. It was supposed to be a fun weekend adventure with my friends, exploring a national park we had always wanted to visit. The group consisted of 5 of us: me, Sarah, Mike, Emily, and Tom. We were all excited and well prepared, or so we thought. We set out early on a Saturday morning, the weather perfect for hiking. The trail was beautiful, winding through dense forests and along clear, bubbling streams. We chatted and laughed, enjoying the fresh air and the escape from our usual routines. Everything was going smoothly until mid-afternoon, when we decided to take a break near a small clearing. As we rested, Tom mentioned he wanted to check out a nearby lookout point he had read about. He assured us it was just a short detour and that he'd be back in no time. We agreed to wait for him while we rested and had a snack. After about 30 minutes, we started to get worried. Tom was taking much longer than he had said. We called out for him, but there was no response. Our initial concern turned into anxiety as we realized something was wrong. We decided to split up into 2 groups to look for him. Sarah and Mike went in one direction, while Emily and I took another. We agreed to meet back at the clearing in an hour if we didn't find him. As Emily and I walked through the forest, the shadows grew longer and the air began to chill. We called out for Tom repeatedly, but the only response was the rustling of leaves and the occasional bird call. Time passed quickly, and soon it was getting dark. We hadn't found any sign of Tom, and when we returned to the clearing, Sarah and Mike were already there, looking worried. They hadn't found him either. Panic started to set in. The realization that we were now all lost in the forest without any means of communication hit us hard. Our phones had no signal, and the temperatures were dropping rapidly. We decided to stick together and find a place to set up camp for the night. As we walked, the forest grew darker, and the cold became more intense. We were not prepared for an overnight stay. We had limited supplies, no tents, and only a few blankets. The fear of not only being lost, but also of the dangers lurking in the forest was palpable. We found a small clearing and decided to stop there for the night. We tried to make a fire, but everything was damp from the recent rain, and it was nearly impossible to get a flame going. We huddled together for warmth, the cold seeping into our bones. The night was long and filled with strange noises. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the bushes made our hearts race. Sleep was out of the question. In the early hours of the morning, we heard a low, menacing growl. Our blood ran cold. We were in bear territory. The realization hit us like a ton of bricks. We had to move and find a safer place, but the dark forest was full of unseen dangers. We cautiously made our way through the trees, trying to be as quiet as possible. The growls seemed to follow us, and we could see shadows moving in the distance. Our fear reached a new level as we realized we were being stalked. After what felt like hours, we stumbled upon a small cave. It was shallow, but it provided some shelter. We quickly gathered what dry wood we could find and managed to start a small fire. The warmth was a relief, but we were far from safe. The growls continued, and the shadows seemed to draw closer. We took turns keeping watch, the firelight casting eerie shadows on the cave walls. As the night dragged on, exhaustion took over. We were physically and mentally drained, our nerves frayed. The tension was unbearable. Every noise made us jump. Every shadow seemed like a threat. The realization that we might not make it out of the forest alive was a sobering thought. Just before dawn, we heard the distant sound of helicopters. Relief washed over us, but we knew we weren't safe yet. We had to signal the rescue team somehow. Sarah had the idea to use the reflective material from our emergency blankets to catch the light of the rising sun. We positioned ourselves at the cave entrance, waving the blankets and shouting with the last of our strength. The helicopters drew closer, and soon we saw the searchlights piercing through the trees. Moments later, we heard the voices of the rescue team calling out for us. We responded with shouts of our own, and within minutes, the rescuers reached our cave. The sense of relief was overwhelming. We were safe. The rescue team escorted us out of the forest, and as we emerged into the daylight, the magnitude of our ordeal hit us. We were cold, hungry, and exhausted, but we were alive. They informed us that Tom had been found earlier in the night by another search team and was safe and sound. Hearing this news brought us a sense of completeness, but the trauma of our experience was still fresh. In the days that followed, we struggled to return to normalcy. The forest, which once seemed like a place of beauty and adventure, now felt menacing and dangerous. The memory of that night haunted us, the growls, the shadows, the fear of never making it out. Each of us dealt with it in our own way, but we all shared a newfound respect for nature and the dangers it held. Our friendship grew stronger from the ordeal, a bond forged in the fires of survival. We became more cautious, more prepared, and more appreciative of the simple things in life. The experience changed us, leaving an indelible mark on our souls. It was a reminder of our vulnerability and the thin line between adventure and danger. Today, when I think back to that fatal excursion, I remember the fear, the cold, and the sense of impending doom. But I also remember the courage, the camaraderie, and the relief of being rescued. It taught me that in the face of adversity, we can find strength we never knew we had, and that sometimes the most important thing is to stick together and never lose hope. The Amboy gas station in California, along the desolate stretch of Route 66, is more than just an abandoned relic of the past. It's a place where the present and the supernatural intersect in eerie and inexplicable ways. My journey there was driven by curiosity and a love for ghost stories, but what I experienced was beyond anything I could have imagined. I arrived in Amboy late in the afternoon, the sun casting long shadows over the empty landscape. The gas station stood alone, a solitary sentinel in the vast desert. Its weathered sign creaked in the wind, and the old pumps, now rusted and unused, seemed to whisper secrets of days gone by. I parked my car and stepped out, the crunch of gravel underfoot the only sound in the stillness. The air was thick with a sense of abandonment and decay, but also something else, an energy that made my skin tingle. I walked around the station, taking in the dilapidated buildings and the silence that seemed almost unnatural. As I explored, I felt a sudden chill, despite the heat of the day. I turned to see a figure standing by the old pumps. It was a man, dressed in dusty work clothes, staring at me with hollow eyes. My heart skipped a beat, but when I blinked, he was gone. I shook my head, trying to rationalize what I had seen. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or my imagination running wild. But the feeling of being watched persisted. I decided to investigate further, hoping to find some clue about the station's haunted reputation. I entered the main building, the door creaking ominously as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was musty, and the remnants of old merchandise littered the shelves. I moved through the rooms, my flashlight casting eerie shadows on the walls. In the back room, I found an old logbook, the pages yellowed and brittle. Flipping through it, I discovered entries dating back decades, detailing the daily operations of the station. As I read, I noticed several entries mentioning strange occurrences, lights flickering, tools moving on their own, and the sound of footsteps when no one was around. One entry in particular caught my eye. It described a tragic accident in which a worker was killed when a car exploded at the pump. The entry was dated June 12, 1968. I felt a chill run down my spine. The description matched the figure I had seen earlier. Could it be that his spirit was still lingering here, unable to move on? Determined to uncover more, I spent the night in my car, parked near the station. As darkness fell, the eerie atmosphere intensified. The wind howled through the empty buildings, and shadows danced in the moonlight. Around midnight, I heard a faint tapping sound, like metal on metal. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the car, the beam cutting through the darkness. The tapping grew louder as I approached the old pump where I had seen the figure. Suddenly, the air around me grew icy cold, and I saw him again. The worker, standing by the pump, looking at me with eyes full of sorrow. This time I didn't look away. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't respond, just stared at me for a long moment before disappearing once again. The coldness lingered, and I felt a deep sense of sadness and loss. It was as if the spirit was trying to communicate, to tell me something. The next day, I visited the local library to see if I could find more information about the accident. The librarian, a woman in her 60s, listened to my story with interest. "You're not the first to see him," she said. "Many people have reported sightings at the old gas station. The man you saw is believed to be Joe Turner, the worker who died in the explosion. It was a tragic accident, and his spirit has been restless ever since." I spent the next few days delving into the history of Amboy and the gas station, speaking with locals and piecing together the story of Joe Turner. I learned that he had been a well-liked member of the community, dedicated to his job and known for his friendly demeanor. His death had been a shock to everyone, and it seemed his spirit had never found peace. One evening, as I stood by the old pump where Joe had died, I spoke aloud, hoping he could hear me. "Joe, if you're here, I want you to know that people remember you. Your story isn't forgotten." As I spoke, the wind seemed to die down, and a calmness settled over the area. The cold chill that had been present during my previous encounters was gone, replaced by a sense of tranquility. It felt as though Joe's spirit had finally found some semblance of peace. But the peace was short-lived. That night, I decided to explore more of the deserted buildings around the gas station. I ventured into what used to be a small diner, now a shell of its former self. The tables and chairs were covered in dust, and the kitchen equipment was rusted and broken. As I walked through the diner, I heard a faint humming sound, like an old tune being softly sung. I followed the sound to the back of the building, where I found a small storage room. The humming stopped abruptly as I entered, and the room grew cold. I could see my breath in the air, despite the desert heat outside. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding, and saw a shadowy figure standing in the corner of the room. It was a woman, her face obscured by darkness. She pointed towards a corner of the room where an old photograph lay on the floor. I picked up the photograph with trembling hands. It was a picture of Joe Turner, standing with a woman who I assumed was his wife. They looked happy, smiling at the camera. I realized then that the woman's spirit was also lingering here, perhaps waiting for Joe. "Is this you?" I asked, turning towards the shadowy figure. She didn't respond, but I felt a wave of sadness wash over me. It was as if she was telling me her story through the emotions that filled the room. I placed the photograph gently back on the floor and whispered, "I'll try to help you." The figure faded, and the room grew warmer. I knew I had to do something to help these spirits find peace. The next day, I reached out to the local community and shared the story of Joe and his wife. Together, we organized a small memorial at the gas station, inviting anyone who had known the couple to come and pay their respects. On the day of the memorial, a small group gathered at the gas station. We shared stories about Joe and his wife, remembering their lives and the impact they had on the community. It was a solemn but hopeful occasion, and I felt a sense of closure begin to form. As the sun set, we placed flowers at the site of the explosion and said a few words in memory of Joe and his wife. The air was warm, and a gentle breeze rustled the flowers. It felt as though their spirits were finally at peace. That night, I decided to stay one last time at the gas station. I wanted to see if the memorial had made a difference. As I sat by the old pump, the air was calm, and the sense of unease was gone. I felt a presence, but it was comforting, as if Joe and his wife were watching over the place, finally reunited. The experience at Amboy gas station was more than just a ghost story. It was a journey of understanding and compassion. It reminded me that the spirits of the past are often seeking closure, just as we do. By acknowledging their stories and remembering their lives, we can help them find peace. As I drove away from Amboy, I felt a sense of fulfillment. The desolate gas station was no longer just a place of tragedy. It was a testament to the enduring connections that bind us all, living and dead. The spirits of Joe Turner and his wife had found their peace, and in doing so, had left an indelible mark on my heart. The haunted gas station of Amboy became more than just a stop on my journey. It became a story of remembrance and connection. I left with a deep respect for the history and the spirits that linger along Route 66. The experience reminded me that the past is never truly gone, and that the stories of those who came before us continue to echo through time. My journey along Route 66 had taken me to many haunted and historic places, but the legend of Amboy gas station was one that would stay with me forever. It was a haunting tale of unexplained phenomena, a story that blended history, tragedy, and the supernatural in a way that left me both fascinated and deeply unsettled. Sarah and I decided to rent a cabin on a beach to celebrate our anniversary. We had been together for 3 years, and this trip was supposed to be a romantic escape from our busy lives. The cabin was perfect, isolated and cozy, perched right on the edge of the beach with a stunning view of the ocean. The moment we arrived, we were enchanted by the tranquility and beauty of the place. We spent the first day walking along the shoreline, collecting seashells and enjoying each other's company without the usual distractions of work and city life. As the sun set, we cooked dinner together, laughing and talking about our future plans. That night, we sat on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the stars. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore was soothing, and we felt completely at peace. It was the perfect start to our getaway. The next day was just as wonderful. We explored the nearby woods, took countless photos, and even dared to take a swim in the chilly water. As evening approached, we decided to stay in and watch a movie. It was during that second night that things started to feel off. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a strange noise. It sounded like a faint scratching, almost as if someone was trying to get in. I shook Sarah awake and she listened with me. The noise seemed to be coming from beneath us. We both felt uneasy but tried to brush it off as the wind or perhaps some animal outside. However, the scratching persisted, growing louder and more insistent. We couldn't ignore it any longer. Juan, being the brave one, decided to investigate. He grabbed a flashlight and I followed close behind, holding onto his arm. The sound was definitely coming from the floor. We moved the rug in the living room and discovered a trapdoor hidden underneath. It was an old wooden hatch, weathered and dusty, almost as if it hadn't been touched in years. With a mix of curiosity and apprehension, we opened the trapdoor, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. The air that wafted up was cool and musty. Taking a deep breath, we descended the stairs, the flashlight beam cutting through the thick darkness. At the bottom of the stairs, we found ourselves in a small underground room. The walls were lined with shelves holding dusty jars and old books. But what caught our attention were the photographs pinned to the walls. They were old, sepia-toned pictures of people, men, women, and children, who looked like they were from different time periods. There was something unsettling about their expressions, a mixture of fear and resignation. As we examined the photos more closely, we realized they were all labeled with names and dates. The dates spanned several decades, and the last entry was from just a few years ago. A chill ran down my spine. These people had all disappeared in this area. As we continued to look around, we noticed strange carvings on the walls, figures and symbols that looked almost ritualistic. The sense of dread grew stronger. Suddenly, the trapdoor above us slammed shut with a loud bang. We were plunged into darkness, the only light coming from Juan's flashlight. We rushed to the stairs and tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as we realized we were trapped. We began to hear noises, footsteps above us, slow and deliberate, and then, to our horror, sinister laughter echoing through the underground room. It felt as if we were being watched, toyed with. Desperate, we searched for another way out. Our flashlight beam flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The room felt colder, and the air grew heavier. The laughter grew louder, more mocking. We screamed for help, but our voices seemed to be swallowed by the darkness. As we fumbled around, our hands brushed against a section of the wall that felt different, hollow. Juan pushed against it, and a hidden panel swung open, revealing a narrow tunnel. Without hesitation, we crawled through the tunnel, the sinister laughter still echoing behind us. The tunnel was claustrophobic, and the darkness seemed to press in from all sides. We could hear the footsteps following us, growing closer with every passing second. After what felt like an eternity, we emerged from the tunnel into the cool night air, finding ourselves on the beach a short distance from the cabin. We didn't stop running until we reached the water's edge, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. We looked back at the cabin, its dark silhouette looming against the night sky. We knew we had to leave immediately. There was something evil about that place, something that wanted us to stay forever. We quickly gathered our belongings and drove away, not looking back. It wasn't until we were miles away that we started to feel safe again. Over the next few days, we couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Nightmares plagued our sleep, and we were haunted by the sounds of footsteps and sinister laughter. Determined to understand what had happened, we began to research the history of the cabin and the area. We discovered that the cabin had a dark past. Over the decades, numerous people had rented it, only to vanish without a trace. The locals had their suspicions, but never any proof. Some believed the cabin was cursed, while others thought it was the work of a madman or something even more sinister. The photographs we had seen were of the missing people, each one lured to the cabin just like us. The more we uncovered, the more we realized how close we had come to becoming part of that history. The carvings we saw in the underground room were linked to ancient rituals, possibly to trap or summon malevolent spirits. It explained the strange occurrences and the feeling of being watched. We considered going to the authorities, but without solid evidence, we doubted anyone would believe our story. Sarah and I made a pact never to speak of the cabin again, hoping that by doing so, we could move on with our lives. We tried to resume our normal routines, but the memories lingered. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind brought us back to that night. We couldn't escape the sense of dread that had followed us from that cursed place. In the end, we decided to move away, far from the coast and the memories that haunted us. It was the only way we could think to start anew. Even then, the nightmares persisted. We would wake up in a cold sweat, the echo of sinister laughter still ringing in our ears. It was a reminder that some places are best left undisturbed, and some mysteries are better left unsolved. The cabin on the beach remains a dark chapter in our lives, a place where shadows linger and the past refuses to stay buried. As a college student on a tight budget, finding affordable housing was a challenge. When I came across an ad for a room for rent in a quaint old house near campus, it seemed too good to be true. The rent was cheap, and the landlady, Mrs. Whitaker, was a sweet, elderly woman who reminded me of my grandmother. From the moment I moved in, Mrs. Whitaker treated me like family. She cooked meals for me, offered to do my laundry, and always had a warm smile and a kind word. The house itself was charming, filled with antique furniture and cozy knickknacks. I felt lucky to have found such a perfect place. But as the weeks went by, I began to notice odd things. Mrs. Whitaker had a habit of talking to herself, which I initially chalked up to her age. But her conversations were more than just idle chatter. They were intense, almost like arguments, with pauses where it seemed she was listening to someone else. One night, as I was heading to bed, I heard her speaking in a low, urgent tone. I crept closer to her room, curious about what she was saying. I know, she whispered. But he's a good boy. He doesn't need to know yet. A chill ran down my spine. Who was she talking to? And what didn't I need to know? I retreated to my room, unease settling over me. The next day, I decided to do some snooping. While Mrs. Whitaker was out shopping, I explored the house, looking for clues. In the basement, I found a locked door. My curiosity piqued. I searched for the key, eventually finding it hidden in a jar on a high shelf. The door creaked open, revealing a room filled with old photographs and personal belongings. But what caught my eye was an altar in the center of the room, adorned with candles, flowers, and framed pictures. I approached it, my heart pounding. The pictures were of young men, all around my age. Beneath each photo was a small, handwritten note. Tommy, 1972, taken too soon. Daniel, 1984, always in my heart. The list went on, each note more unsettling than the last. As I examined the altar, I heard the front door open. Panic set in, and I quickly locked the basement door and returned the key to its hiding place. I hurried back to my room, my mind racing. What was Mrs. Whitaker hiding, and who were those men? That night, I had trouble sleeping. My dreams were filled with images of the altar and the photographs. When I finally drifted off, it was only to be awakened by the sound of footsteps outside my door. I lay still, my heart racing as the footsteps paused, then moved on. The next morning, I confronted Mrs. Whitaker. "I found the room in the basement," I said, my voice trembling. "Who are those men?" Her expression darkened, and for a moment, I thought she might lash out. But then her face softened, and she sighed. "They were my tenants," she said quietly. "All of them. They were like family to me." "Then why the altar?" I asked. "Why the secrecy?" Her eyes grew distant. "I lost them all," she said. "One by one. Accidents, illnesses, they all left me. The altar is my way of keeping their memory alive." Her explanation was plausible, but something about it didn't sit right with me. The intensity of her conversations, the way she spoke to herself, it all pointed to something more sinister. Determined to uncover the truth, I decided to dig deeper. Over the next few days, I kept a close watch on Mrs. Whitaker, noting her behavior and the patterns of her conversations. She continued to talk to herself, but now I noticed other oddities. She would disappear for hours, and when she returned, she seemed different, more tired, more irritable. I began to search the house for more clues. One evening, while Mrs. Whitaker was out, I found a hidden compartment in her bedroom closet. Inside was a journal filled with entries dating back decades. As I read through it, a horrifying picture emerged. The journal detailed the lives of her tenants, each entry becoming more disturbing as time went on. She wrote about her attachment to them, how they filled the void left by her husband's death. But the entries grew darker, describing strange rituals and sacrifices. One entry in particular caught my eye. March 3rd, 1996. "Stephen has been so kind, so helpful, but he's been asking questions. I can't let him leave. The ritual must be performed. He will be with me forever." My blood ran cold. It wasn't just about keeping their memory alive. She believed she was trapping their spirits, binding them to her through some twisted ritual. I realized with growing horror that I was next. I needed to get out, but I couldn't just leave. I had to expose her to make sure no one else fell victim to her madness. I took photos of the journal entries and the altar, compiling as much evidence as I could. That night, I packed a bag, ready to leave at a moment's notice. But as I lay in bed, my mind racing, I heard her voice outside my door again. "He knows," she whispered. "We have to act quickly." I jumped out of bed, my heart pounding. I grabbed my bag and quietly opened the window, preparing to climb out. But as I did, the door burst open, and Mrs. Whitaker stood there, her eyes wild with fury. "Where do you think you're going?" she hissed, advancing towards me. I backed away, my mind racing. "I'm leaving," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I know what you've done, and I'm going to the police." She laughed, a cold, menacing sound. "You think anyone will believe you? An old woman performing rituals? They'll think you're crazy." I had no choice. I had to escape. I turned and climbed out the window, dropping to the ground below. I heard her shouting after me, but I didn't look back. I ran as fast as I could, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't stop until I reached the police station. Bursting through the doors, I demanded to see an officer. I showed them the photos and explained everything. They were skeptical at first, but the evidence was compelling enough for them to investigate. The next day, they raided Mrs. Whitaker's house. They found the altar, the journal, and enough evidence to arrest her. She was charged with multiple counts of murder and unlawful imprisonment. The community was in shock, unable to reconcile the kindly old woman they knew with the monster she had become. As the investigation unfolded, more details came to light. Mrs. Whitaker had indeed been performing rituals, using dark magic to bind the spirits of her tenants to her. The journal entries were verified, and the remains of several of her previous tenants were found buried in the backyard. The trial was a media sensation, with people flocking to hear the sordid details of her crimes. She maintained her innocence, claiming that she was only trying to protect her tenants and keep them close. But the evidence was overwhelming, and she was found guilty on all counts. Despite her conviction, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The house was sold, and I moved to a new apartment, trying to put the whole ordeal behind me. But the memories lingered, haunting my dreams and making me question the safety of my new home. One night, as I was settling into bed, I heard a familiar sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping. My heart raced, and I froze, listening intently. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, scanning the room. There, in the corner, was a small, antique mirror. I had found it at a flea market and thought it would add a touch of charm to my new place. But now, it seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. I approached it cautiously, my breath shallow. The tapping continued, and as I looked into the mirror, I saw a shadowy figure standing behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned back to the mirror. The figure was still there, its face twisted in a silent scream. I recognized it. It was one of Mrs. Whitaker's victims. The mirror began to ripple, and the tapping grew louder, almost deafening. I knew I had to act. I grabbed the mirror and threw it to the ground, shattering it into pieces. The tapping stopped, and the room fell silent. I collapsed onto the floor, my heart racing, as the reality of what had just happened sank in. The next day, I called a psychic to cleanse my apartment. She performed a ritual, assuring me that the spirits were now at peace. But I knew that I would never be free from the shadows of my past. The experience had changed me, making me hyper-aware of the unseen forces that lurked in the corners of our world. I continued my studies, but I also began to delve into the paranormal, seeking to understand the dark magic that Mrs. Whitaker had practiced. In the years that followed, I became a paranormal investigator, helping others who found themselves entangled in the supernatural. Each case brought its own challenges, but I approached them with a newfound sense of purpose and determination. And so, my life took a different path, shaped by the horrors I had faced. I remained vigilant, always aware that the line between the mundane and the supernatural was thinner than most people realized. And I vowed to never forget the lessons I had learned from the kindly old lady who had hidden such dark secrets behind her sweet smile. I was always a passionate surfer, constantly on the lookout for new waves and thrilling adventures. One day, I heard about a beach renowned for its massive waves, but also notorious for being dangerous. This beach, known as Playa de las Sombras, had a dark reputation due to the numerous disappearances and accidents that had occurred there. However, this didn't deter me. On the contrary, I was determined to test my skills in such a challenging place. I arrived at the beach early in the morning, just as the sun was beginning to illuminate the horizon. The waves were incredible, tall and powerful, exactly what I had been searching for. I quickly prepared my gear and launched into the water, exhilarated by the opportunity to surf in such an intense location. That first day was fantastic. I reveled in the waves and the solitude of the beach. There weren't many surfers around, just a few locals who watched me with a mix of curiosity and concern. As the day drew to a close, while I was putting away my board, an old surfer approached me. He warned me about the beach, saying that years ago, a surfer had died there, and his spirit still haunted the waves, seeking company. I brushed off his warning, thinking it was just a local legend, and continued to surf. That night, I camped on the beach, enjoying the sound of the sea and the cool breeze. However, my sleep was disturbed by unsettling dreams. I dreamed of an unknown surfer staring at me from the waves, his eyes dark and empty. The whispers of the wind seemed to call my name, inviting me into the water. The next morning, I found my board covered in seaweed and strange marks, as if it had been dragged along the ocean floor. Ignoring these eerie signs, I went back to the waves. While I was surfing, I noticed a figure on the horizon, a surfer with an old board who seemed to be following me. I tried to get closer, but the figure vanished into the waves. One afternoon, the waves were particularly big and challenging. I was riding the crest of a wave when I saw the ghostly surfer clearly. The figure looked at me with a blank expression and a sinister smile. I lost my balance and fell into the water. As I struggled to surface, I felt something pulling me down. Desperate, I managed to break free and swim to the shore. That night, I decided to confront the ghostly surfer. Under the full moon, I ventured into the sea, hoping to solve the mystery. The waves were violent, and the darkness enveloped me, but I was determined. Suddenly, I saw the figure again, closer than ever. The ghostly surfer stared at me and began to approach. I felt a coldness and a sense of despair wash over me. The figure reached me, and in an instant, I felt the world fade around me. The water turned icy, and the whispers grew louder. I was being dragged toward the bottom of the sea, unable to fight the force pulling me down. I woke up on the shore with the first light of dawn, exhausted and trembling, but alive. The beach was deserted, with no sign of the ghostly surfer. I quickly gathered my things and left the beach, vowing never to return. Days later, while talking with other surfers, I discovered that many had had similar experiences at Playa de las Sombras. Stories of encounters with the ghostly surfer were common, and everyone agreed that something dark and sinister inhabited those waters. I could never forget what I experienced at Playa de las Sombras. Although I tried to resume my normal life, the experience changed me forever. The waves and the sea, which were once my passion, now filled me with fear. The sensation of being watched and the whispers in the wind haunted me, turning my love for surfing into a constant source of anxiety. The memory of the ghostly surfer remained etched in my mind, a nightmare that I could never shake off. Playa de las Sombras was a place that changed everything for me. The adventure I sought turned into a terrifying ordeal that left me questioning my once unshakable love for the ocean. Each time I closed my eyes, I could still see the ghostly surfer's sinister smile and feel the icy grip pulling me towards the depths. It became clear that the beach was cursed, and the legends were more than just stories. They were warnings. Despite my best efforts to move on, the experience lingered. I tried to find solace in the familiar waves of other beaches, but the fear followed me. Every shadow on the water, every unexpected splash made my heart race. I could no longer find the peace I once felt on my board. The ocean, which had been my sanctuary, had become a reminder of that fateful encounter. The stories of other surfers who had faced the ghostly figure did little to comfort me. Some had narrowly escaped like I did, while others were never seen again. The shared tales of terror only solidified the beach's reputation as a place to avoid. Playa de las Sombras had claimed many, and I was one of the lucky few who had survived. In the end, I knew I had to let go of surfing. The risk of encountering the ghostly surfer again was too great. I sold my board and distanced myself from the surfing community. It was a heartbreaking decision, but my fear overshadowed my passion. Life went on, but the shadow of Playa de las Sombras loomed over me. I took up new hobbies, made new friends, and built a different life. But the ocean always called to me. It was a bittersweet melody, reminding me of what I had lost and what I had narrowly escaped. The memory of the ghostly surfer was a scar, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurks in the depths of the sea. Years later, I returned to the coast, not to surf, but to find closure. I stood on a cliff overlooking Playa de las Sombras, watching the waves crash against the rocks. The beach looked the same, deceptively inviting, but I knew better. The spirits of those who had vanished were still there, and the ghostly surfer still roamed the waves, waiting for his next victim. As I left, I felt a sense of peace. I had faced my fears and acknowledged the past. The ocean would always be a part of me, but I had learned to respect its power and the mysteries it held. Playa de las Sombras was a place of beauty and danger, a reminder that some adventures are better left unexplored. The ghostly surfer remained a legend, a story whispered among surfers, a cautionary tale for those who dared to challenge the waves. And for me, it was a chapter of my life that had closed, but not without leaving a mark. The sea had changed me, but I had also found strength in my survival. The memory of Playa de las Sombras would always haunt me, but it also reminded me of my resilience and the power of the human spirit to endure even the most terrifying of experiences. Route 66 is known for its rich history and charming stops, but few places have captivated me as much as the Rialto Theater in Joliet, Illinois. This grand old theater, with its ornate architecture and timeless elegance, has been a cultural hub since it opened in the 1920s. However, it's not just the performances that draw people in, it's also the ghostly tales that surround it. I arrived in Joliet on a crisp autumn afternoon, eager to explore the historic town and, of course, the famous Rialto Theater. I had read about its haunted reputation, and as a lover of the paranormal, I couldn't resist the chance to investigate. The theater loomed majestically as I approached, its grand facade a testament to the golden age of cinema. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with nostalgia. The plush red seats, the grand chandeliers, and the echoes of past performances all added to the sense of history. But there was something else, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I met with one of the theater's longtime employees, a kind man named Tom, who had worked there for over 3 decades. He was more than willing to share the ghost stories that had become part of the theater's lore. "You ever hear of Esmeralda?" he asked, a twinkle in his eye. I shook my head. "No. Who's that?" "Esmeralda was an actress in the early days of the theater," Tom explained. "Legend has it she died tragically young, right here in the theater. Some say she fell from the balcony during a performance. Others say she took her own life. Either way, her spirit is said to haunt this place." Tom led me to the balcony where Esmeralda supposedly met her end. As I stood there, looking out over the empty seats, I felt a sudden chill. The air seemed to crackle with energy, and I could almost hear the faint sound of a woman singing. It was as if the theater itself was alive with the echoes of the past. "People have reported seeing her," Tom continued. "A figure in a long, flowing dress, wandering the halls or appearing in the balconies. Lights flicker, doors slam, and sometimes you can hear her singing. She was known for her beautiful voice, you know." That evening, I attended a performance at the Rialto. The show was fantastic, but I couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation. As the final act concluded and the audience applauded, I scanned the balconies, half expecting to see a ghostly figure watching from above. After the show, the theater emptied out, leaving me and a few staff members behind. I had arranged to stay late and explore, hoping to catch a glimpse of Esmeralda or any other spectral inhabitants. Tom accompanied me, sharing more stories as we wandered through the dimly lit corridors and backstage areas. As we stood on the stage, the house lights dimmed, and the theater fell into an eerie silence. Tom and I listened intently, straining to hear any sounds that might indicate a ghostly presence. Suddenly, there was a faint humming sound, like someone singing softly. The hair on my arm stood on end. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. Tom nodded, his expression serious. "That's her. That's Esmeralda." We followed the sound, which seemed to lead us to one of the dressing rooms. The door was slightly ajar, and a cold draft seeped through. As we pushed the door open, the humming stopped abruptly, leaving us in a heavy silence. The room was empty, but the air felt charged with an unseen presence. "I've never seen her myself," Tom said, his voice hushed. "But I've felt her, just like this. She's here." I spent the rest of the night in the theater, experiencing small, inexplicable events, lights flickering, a door creaking open by itself, the sound of footsteps echoing in the empty hallways. By the time the first light of dawn broke through, I felt a mix of exhilaration and exhaustion. The Rialto Theater had lived up to its haunted reputation. While I didn't see Esmeralda with my own eyes, the experiences I had were enough to convince me that something otherworldly lingered within those walls. The spirits of the past, the echoes of performances long gone, and the tragic tales woven into the fabric of the theater made it a place where history and the supernatural coexisted. My curiosity piqued. I returned to the Rialto the next day to delve deeper into the history of Esmeralda. I headed to the local library, where I met with a librarian named Margaret. She had a wealth of knowledge about Joliet's history and was more than willing to help me uncover the truth. Esmeralda was indeed a real person, Margaret confirmed as she pulled out an old newspaper article. She was a rising star in the 1920s, known for her incredible voice and captivating stage presence. But her life was tragically cut short. Margaret handed me the article, and I read about the night Esmeralda died. It was during a sold-out performance, and the theater was packed. Witnesses reported seeing her step out onto the balcony, where she suddenly fell to her death. The cause of the fall was never determined, and rumors of foul play and heartbreak circulated in the aftermath. There were whispers that she was pushed, Margaret said quietly. Others believe she jumped because of a broken heart. She was in love with a fellow actor, but their relationship was fraught with turmoil. Armed with this new information, I returned to the Rialto that evening, determined to connect with Esmeralda's spirit. I brought along a digital recorder, hoping to capture any electronic voice phenomena, EVPs. Tom joined me, curious about what we might uncover. We settled into the balcony, the site of Esmeralda's tragic fall. The air was still, and the theater was cloaked in shadows. I turned on the recorder and began asking questions, speaking softly into the darkness. "Esmeralda, are you here with us?" I asked. "Can you tell us what happened that night?" For several minutes, there was nothing but silence. Then, faintly, we heard a whisper. It was barely audible, but it was there. We played back the recording, straining to make out the words. "Help me," the voice said. It was Esmeralda. My heart raced as I continued to ask questions, hoping for more responses. "Esmeralda, did someone hurt you? Were you pushed?" The recorder picked up another whisper, this one clearer. "No, love," the voice said. Tom and I exchanged glances, our eyes wide. It seemed that Esmeralda was communicating with us, sharing fragments of her story. We continued the session, asking about her life, her love, and her tragic end. As the night wore on, we captured more EVPs, each one providing a glimpse into Esmeralda's life and her lingering presence in the theater. She spoke of love and betrayal, of dreams unfulfilled, and of a sadness that bound her to the Rialto. The most poignant moment came when we asked if she found peace. There was a long pause, and then, softly, we heard, "Almost." I felt a deep sense of compassion for Esmeralda. She was a spirit caught between worlds, yearning for closure. I knew we had to do something to help her find peace. Tom and I decided to organize a tribute to Esmeralda, a special performance dedicated to her memory. We invited local actors and musicians to participate, recreating some of the performances she had once graced the stage with. The event drew a large crowd, and the theater was filled with an energy that seemed to breathe new life into its walls. As the performance reached its climax, I felt a presence in the balcony. I looked up and saw a faint, shimmering figure. It was Esmeralda, watching over us. Her face was serene, and for the first time, I felt that she was at peace. After the tribute, I returned to the balcony one last time. The air was warm, and the theater felt different, lighter. I turned on the recorder and spoke softly. "Esmeralda, we hope you enjoyed the tribute. We did this for you, to honor your memory." I played back the recording, and there, clear as day, was her voice. "Thank you," she said. "Goodbye." Tears filled my eyes as I realized that Esmeralda had finally found the peace she had been searching for. The haunting of the Rialto Theater had come to an end, but the memory of Esmeralda would live on in the hearts of those who had come to know her story. My experience at the Rialto Theater was more than just an exploration of the paranormal. It was a journey into the past, a connection with a spirit who had once been full of life and dreams. As I left Joliet, I carried with me a sense of fulfillment, knowing that I had helped bring closure to a soul who had been lost for so long. The haunted Rialto Theater was no longer just a place of ghostly tales. It was a place of remembrance, where history and the supernatural had intertwined to create a story that would never be forgotten. When I moved into my new apartment, I was eager for a fresh start. The building was old, but charming, with creaky wooden floors and a view of the city skyline. My neighbor, Mr. Davis, lived next door, but I never saw him. His apartment door was always closed, and there was an eerie silence that seemed to emanate from within. The first few weeks were uneventful. I settled into my routine, unpacking boxes and exploring the neighborhood. But it wasn't long before I noticed something odd. Mr. Davis's mail was piling up, and there was no sign of life from his apartment. I asked the building manager about him, and she shrugged. "Mr. Davis? Haven't seen him in a while. Quiet guy, keeps to himself." Her nonchalance struck me as strange. How could someone go unnoticed for so long? My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate. One evening, I knocked on his door. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. Determined, I jiggled the handle. To my surprise, it turned, and the door creaked open. I hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one was watching, before stepping inside. The apartment was dark and musty, with a palpable sense of abandonment. Dust coated the furniture, and cobwebs hung from the corners. "Mr. Davis?" I called out, my voice echoing in the empty space. There was no response. I ventured further in, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The living room was sparsely furnished, and the kitchen looked like it hadn't been used in months. As I approached the bedroom, I noticed a faint sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping. My heart pounded as I pushed open the bedroom door. The room was empty, but the tapping continued, coming from the closet. I approached cautiously, my breath shallow. With a trembling hand, I flung open the closet door. Inside was a small, old-fashioned radio, its dial spinning on its own, emitting static and that persistent tapping sound. I turned it off, and the silence that followed was deafening. As I stood there, trying to make sense of what I'd found, I noticed something else, an envelope taped to the back wall of the closet. I peeled it off and opened it, revealing a letter written in shaky handwriting. "Help me. He's watching." A chill ran down my spine. Who was watching, and where was Mr. Davis? I pocketed the letter and quickly left the apartment, locking the door behind me. Back in my own apartment, I examined the letter more closely. The handwriting was frantic, and the words seemed to blur together in some places. It was clear that Mr. Davis had been terrified. I decided to do some digging. Online searches revealed little about Mr. Davis, but I did find a few articles about strange occurrences in the building, residents reporting eerie noises, objects moving on their own, and glimpses of shadowy figures. It seemed my new home had a dark history. Over the next few days, the strange events began to escalate. I heard footsteps in the hallway late at night, but when I checked, no one was there. My lights flickered, and I felt a constant sense of being watched. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, I reached out to other tenants in the building. Most were reluctant to talk, brushing off my questions with nervous smiles. But one old woman, Mrs. Jensen, was more forthcoming. "Mr. Davis wasn't the first to go missing," she told me in a hushed tone. "Over the years, several tenants have disappeared without a trace. Always the ones living in that apartment." Her words sent a chill down my spine. "What do you mean?" She glanced around, as if afraid of being overheard. "There's something wrong with that apartment. It's like it's alive. I've heard things, seen things. Shadows moving when there shouldn't be any. Voices whispering at night." My skepticism was waning, replaced by a growing sense of dread. I thanked Mrs. Jensen and returned to my apartment, my mind racing. If what she said was true, then Mr. Davis was in serious trouble, if he was even still alive. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to every creak and groan of the old building. Around midnight, I heard it again, the soft, rhythmic tapping coming from Mr. Davis's apartment. I grabbed my flashlight and ventured into the hallway. The sound grew louder as I approached his door. My hands trembled as I unlocked it and stepped inside. The apartment was as dark and silent as before, but the tapping persisted. It was coming from the bedroom again. I made my way there, my heart pounding in my chest. The closet door was ajar, and the tapping seemed to be coming from within. As I approached, a sense of foreboding washed over me. I swung the closet door open, expecting to find the radio again, but it was gone. Instead, there was a hole in the back wall, just large enough for someone to crawl through. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, but my curiosity and my concern for Mr. Davis propelled me forward. I squeezed through the hole, emerging into a narrow, dimly lit passageway. The air was thick with dust and the scent of decay. I followed the passage, the tapping sound growing louder with each step. After what felt like an eternity, I reached a small, hidden room. In the center of the room was a large, ornate mirror, its surface covered in grime. The tapping was louder now, coming from behind the mirror. I reached out and wiped away some of the grime, revealing a figure on the other side. It was Mr. Davis. His eyes were wide with fear, and he was tapping on the glass, trying to get my attention. I stared in horror, realizing he was trapped on the other side, in some kind of twisted reflection. "Help me," he mouthed, his voice muffled by the glass. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced, trying to find a solution. But before I could act, the mirror's surface began to ripple, like water disturbed by a stone. Mr. Davis's expression turned to one of terror, and he was pulled away, disappearing into the darkness beyond the glass. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. The mirror went still, its surface once again reflecting the empty room. I knew I had to get out of there, to find someone who could help. But as I turned to leave, I heard a voice, a soft, whispering voice, coming from the mirror. "You're next." Panic surged through me as I fled the hidden room, the whispering voice echoing in my mind. I crawled back through the hole in the closet, desperate to escape the nightmare I had stumbled into. Back in Mr. Davis's apartment, I slammed the door behind me and leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. I needed help, but who could I turn to? The police would think I was crazy if I told them about mirrors and hidden rooms. And even if they believed me, what could they do against something so supernatural? I decided to reach out to the reporter who had helped me before. I sent him an urgent email explaining everything I had discovered. I didn't expect a quick response, but to my surprise, he replied almost immediately. "I'm on my way," his message read. "Stay put and don't go back in there." I followed his advice, locking myself in my apartment and waiting anxiously for his arrival. Every creak and shadow outside my window set my nerves on edge, and I kept glancing at the clock, counting the minutes. Finally, there was a knock on my door. I opened it to find the reporter standing there, looking grim but determined. "Show me," he said. I led him to Mr. Davis's apartment, and we ventured inside together. I showed him the hidden passage and the mirror room, my fear palpable as we approached the cursed glass. The reporter examined the mirror, his expression unreadable. "This is incredible," he murmured, "but also very dangerous." "What do we do?" I asked, my voice shaking. He turned to me, his eyes serious. "We need to destroy it. Whatever this mirror is, it's a conduit, a gateway to something evil. If we break it, we might be able to free Mr. Davis and stop whatever force is behind this." I nodded, my fear mingled with a sense of hope. We returned to my apartment to gather supplies, tools, ropes, anything we might need. Armed with a sledgehammer, we headed back to the hidden room. The mirror seemed to hum with malevolent energy as we approached, the air growing colder. The reporter handed me the sledgehammer, his expression resolute. "Do it," he said. "Quickly." I raised the hammer, my hands trembling. With all my strength, I brought it down on the mirror's surface. The glass shattered, fragments flying in all directions. A deafening roar filled the room, and the ground trembled beneath our feet. As the mirror broke, a dark, swirling vortex appeared, pulling at everything in the room. I clung to the reporter, both of us struggling to stay grounded. Through the chaos, I glimpsed Mr. Davis, his figure emerging from the vortex, his face a mix of relief and terror. The vortex began to collapse in on itself, the roar intensifying. We were thrown back as a final blinding flash of light filled the room. Then, silence. When I opened my eyes, the mirror was gone, replaced by an empty frame. The air was still, and the sense of malevolence had vanished. Mr. Davis lay on the floor, unconscious but alive. The reporter and I rushed to his side, helping him up. "We did it," I whispered, a sense of disbelief washing over me. "We actually did it." Mr. Davis slowly regained consciousness, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice hoarse. "I thought I'd never escape." We helped him back to my apartment, where we called for medical assistance. The paramedics arrived and took Mr. Davis to the hospital, assuring us he would recover. The reporter and I stayed behind, our minds reeling from the night's events. We sat in silence, processing everything that had happened. Finally, he spoke. "We need to make sure this doesn't happen again. I'll write the story, expose the truth about this place. People need to know." I nodded, grateful for his help. As he left, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The nightmare was over, and Mr. Davis was safe. But I knew I would never forget what I had seen, the horrors lurking just beyond the surface of our reality. Life slowly returned to normal, but I remained vigilant, always wary of the shadows. The building felt different, lighter, as if a dark cloud had been lifted. But I knew that the true danger lay in the unknown, in the mysteries that still lurked in the corners of our world. And so, I continued my life with a newfound appreciation for the mundane, always aware that the line between reality and nightmare was thinner than I had ever imagined. My name is John, and I want to share an experience that I will never forget. I work in a skyscraper in the downtown area, and that day seemed like any other. I was heading to my office on the 30th floor, accompanied by some colleagues, when everything turned into a real nightmare. We had a pretty calm morning at the office. After lunch, a few of us decided to go down to the lobby for a coffee. We got into the elevator and began our descent. However, halfway down, the elevator suddenly stopped. We looked at each other confused, but tried not to worry too much. It must be a temporary malfunction, we thought. A few minutes passed, and the elevator did not move. We tried using the intercom, but it wasn't working. We checked our phones, and to our surprise, there was no signal. The temperature in the elevator started to rise, and the air was becoming increasingly dense. We tried to stay calm and wait, but time passed, and the situation became more desperate. As the hours passed, the heat became unbearable. Without adequate ventilation, we started to feel dizzy and claustrophobic. We tried to open the doors, but they were locked. We began pounding and shouting, hoping someone would hear us, but there was no response. Panic began to take hold of us. One of my colleagues, Mark, tried to reassure us, saying that surely the security system would activate soon and we would be rescued. However, time passed, and there were no signs of help. The atmosphere in the elevator grew increasingly tense. The hours felt like days, and the desperation grew. We started rationing the water and food we had in our backpacks, aware that we didn't know how long we would be there. Night came, bringing with it total darkness. Without electricity, the elevator plunged into absolute darkness. We heard noises outside the elevator, but we couldn't identify where they were coming from. Every sound heightened our paranoia and fear. We tried to stay together, talking to avoid losing our sanity, but the fear was palpable. The second night was even worse. The heat continued to rise, and the air was unbreathable. One of my colleagues, Emily, began to hyperventilate and show severe signs of panic. We tried to calm her down, but her screams echoed in the small metal box, amplifying our own anxiety. Mark and I tried to open the doors with more force, but they were completely stuck. We pounded and shouted with all our might, but no one responded. As time went on, we began to notice that one of us was not behaving normally. Luke, who had been quiet for most of the time, started muttering incoherent things. At first, we thought it was just stress, but soon his mutterings turned into screams. He said someone was watching us, that we were not alone in the elevator. His eyes reflected a deep fear, and his words began to disturb us all. Mark tried to reason with Luke, telling him that it was all in his mind, that the isolation and heat were affecting him. But Luke didn't calm down. His screams became more acute, and his behavior more erratic. In a moment of panic, he tried to force one of the doors with a strength we didn't know he had. That's when the accident happened. One of the doors opened slightly, and Luke stuck his hand in, trying to open it further. But something went wrong, and the door slammed shut, trapping his hand and causing a severe injury. Luke's blood and his screams of pain added another layer of terror to our situation. We tried to stop the bleeding with what little we had on hand, but his condition deteriorated rapidly. Minutes turned into hours, and hours into days. Luke's wound began to get infected, and his delusions worsened. Every time we closed our eyes to try to rest, Luke's screams and the absolute darkness kept us in a state of terrified wakefulness. On the third day, Mark and I decided we had to do something. We couldn't keep waiting to be rescued. Luke's life was hanging by a thread, and we were all on the verge of collapse. We decided to try opening the ceiling hatch of the elevator, hoping to find a way out. We used the improvised tools we had, and after what seemed like hours of effort, we managed to open a small gap in the ceiling. Mark was the first to climb out. He climbed through the gap and started looking for a way to get us out of there. He shouted to us from above, saying he was looking for help. But hours passed, and we didn't hear his voice again. Emily and I stayed in the elevator with Luke, who was getting weaker by the minute. The lack of news from Mark increased our desperation. Finally, on the fourth day, we heard noises from the ceiling. We looked up and saw the face of a firefighter. I couldn't hold back the tears of relief. They told us there had been a massive power outage in the city, and many communication systems had failed. They had been searching for people trapped in buildings and had finally found us. They took us out of the elevator one by one. Luke was taken to the hospital immediately, and Emily and I received medical attention for dehydration and exhaustion. Later, we learned that Mark had found help, but on his way back to the elevator, he had fainted from the heat and exertion. They found him shortly after and took him to the hospital as well. The experience left us with deep scars. The feeling of being trapped, the darkness, the heat, and Luke's erratic behavior all contributed to an experience I will never forget. Every time I step into an elevator, I feel a pang of anxiety. That metal box, which I once considered just a simple part of daily life, is now a constant reminder of our fragility and the thin line that separates normalcy from chaos. I've always been a fan of road trips. The open road, the sense of adventure, the stories waiting to be discovered. There's nothing quite like it. But my journey along Route 66 introduced me to a story I never expected to be a part of. The legend of the Phantom Hitchhiker. It was a clear, starry night as I drove through the desolate stretches of Route 66. I had been on the road for hours, and the rhythmic hum of the tires on the asphalt was almost hypnotic. The silence was only broken by the occasional coyote howl in the distance. As I drove, I noticed a figure standing by the side of the road, thumbing for a ride. I slowed down, surprised to see someone out here in the middle of nowhere. The figure was a young man, dressed in jeans and a leather jacket. He looked like he had stepped out of a different era. I pulled over and rolled down the window. "Need a ride?" I asked. "Thanks," he said, his voice calm and steady. He climbed into the passenger seat and gave me a nod. "Appreciate it." "No problem," I replied, glancing at him. "Where are you headed?" "Just a little further down the road," he said, staring straight ahead. We drove in silence for a while. There was something off about him, something that made me uneasy. He didn't talk much, just sat there quietly. I tried to make small talk, but his responses were short and to the point. As we approached a stretch of road known for its sharp curves, he suddenly turned to me. "You should be careful around here," he said, his voice serious. "A lot of accidents happen on this road." I nodded, wondering how he knew that. The curves were treacherous, and I had heard stories of crashes and fatalities in this area. But something about the way he said it gave me chills. As we continued, I noticed the temperature in the car had dropped significantly. I glanced at the dashboard, but the heater was working fine. It was as if a cold presence had settled in the car. I glanced at my passenger, but he seemed unaffected. We reached the end of the curve, and he pointed to a small turnoff ahead. "You can drop me off there," he said. I pulled over, but as soon as he opened the door, he vanished. just disappeared into thin air. My heart pounded, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I looked around, but there was no sign of him. It was as if he had never been there. Shaken, I drove to the nearest town and found a diner. I needed to talk to someone, to try to make sense of what had just happened. I told the waitress about the hitchhiker. She listened, her eyes widening. "You saw him?" she asked, her voice hushed. "Yeah," I replied. "Who is he?" She leaned in, lowering her voice. "There's a legend about a phantom hitchhiker on that stretch of road. They say he's the spirit of a young man who died in a car crash there years ago. People who pick him up report strange things, like the temperature dropping and him giving warnings about the road, and he always disappears without a trace." A chill ran down my spine. I had become part of the legend of Route 66. The encounter with the phantom hitchhiker was something I would never forget, a ghostly reminder of the dangers and mysteries that lurk along this historic highway. Over the following weeks, I couldn't shake the memory of that night. I kept thinking about the hitchhiker, wondering if there was any way to explain what I had experienced. I decided to return to the spot where he had disappeared, hoping to find some clue that might shed light on the mystery. It was another cold night when I returned to the road. I parked my car and walked to the small turnoff. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. As I stood there, I felt the same chill in the air. The silence was almost deafening, and I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. I called out, "Is anyone here?" My voice echoed in the stillness. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, I heard a faint whisper, so soft I could barely make it out. "Be careful," it said. I spun around, my heart racing. There was no one there, but the voice had been real. It sounded like the hitchhiker. Determined to get to the bottom of this, I decided to spend the night in my car, parked by the side of the road. The hours passed slowly. I kept my eyes on the turnoff, waiting for any sign of the hitchhiker. Just as I was starting to doze off, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. There he was, standing by the side of the road, looking just as he had that first night. I got out of the car and approached him slowly. "Who are you?" I asked. He turned to face me, his eyes filled with sadness. "I need to warn them," he said. "I need to warn people about the curve." "How can I help you?" I asked, stepping closer. "Tell them to be careful," he whispered. "Tell them to slow down. The curve is dangerous." Before I could say anything else, he vanished again. But this time, I felt a sense of purpose. I had to help him get his message across. I spent the next few days researching, trying to find any information about a young man who had died in a car crash on that stretch of road. It wasn't easy, but eventually I came across an old newspaper article about a fatal accident that had occurred there years ago. The young man had died when his car went off the road at the curve. I decided to share his story, hoping it would serve as a warning to others. I wrote an article about the dangers of the curve, including the legend of the phantom hitchhiker. It was published in the local paper, and soon people started talking about it. Over time, the number of accidents at the curve decreased. Drivers became more cautious, aware of the dangers and the ghostly warning. The legend of the phantom hitchhiker became more than just a story. It became a life-saving message. As I continued my journey along Route 66, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. The encounter with the phantom hitchhiker had changed me, and I knew that in some small way, I had helped make the road a little safer for others. My name is Laura, and this is the story of how my neighbor turned into my worst nightmare. It all began when I moved into a new apartment in a small town. I was excited to start a new chapter in my life, but I had no idea what lay ahead. My next-door neighbor, Carlos, was a middle-aged man who lived alone. At first, He seemed a bit odd, but harmless. He always greeted me with a nervous smile, and I often saw him sitting on his porch, staring into the distance. I didn't think much of him until things started to get strange. One day, I came home from work and noticed that my door was slightly ajar. I entered cautiously, thinking I might have forgotten to close it, but my intuition told me something was wrong. I quickly inspected the apartment, and although nothing seemed to be missing, I had the feeling that someone had been there. I decided to install a security camera in the living room, just to be safe. For the next few nights, everything seemed normal until one morning when I reviewed the footage. To my horror, I saw Carlos entering my apartment in the middle of the night. He wandered around the living room, inspecting my belongings, and then sat on my couch, staring fixedly at my bedroom door. Fear paralyzed me. I didn't know what to do. I called the police and showed them the video. They arrived quickly and arrested Carlos. He denied everything, but the footage was clear. Carlos was released on bail but had a restraining order prohibiting him from approaching me or my apartment. From that moment on, I started noticing strange things in my apartment. Objects moved out of place, windows opened that I had closed, and the constant feeling of being watched. Every time I saw Carlos from a distance, he gave me a creepy smile that sent shivers down my spine. One night, while trying to sleep, I heard a noise in the kitchen. My heart raced as I grabbed my phone to call the police, but before I could dial, my bedroom door slowly opened. There stood Carlos, his expression disturbing. "What are you doing here?" I screamed, my voice trembling with fear. "You shouldn't leave your door open," he murmured, stepping toward me. I screamed with all my might, and fortunately, my neighbors heard and called the police. Carlos tried to flee, but the officers arrived in time and arrested him. I discovered that Carlos had been entering my apartment using a master key he had somehow obtained. He was charged with breaking and entering and stalking, and eventually, he was sentenced to prison. Even though Carlos was no longer around, the experience left me traumatized. I changed all the locks and reinforced the security in my apartment. However, the fear and paranoia persisted for a long time. I learned to be more cautious and aware of my surroundings. Months before discovering the recordings, Carlos and I had normal neighborly interactions. He helped me with a few things in my apartment, like changing a light bulb and carrying a heavy box. I always thought he was just being kind, though a bit reserved. I never thought this would lead to him developing an obsession with me. Shortly after the incident with the ajar door, I noticed my pets, a cat and a dog, began acting strangely. My cat, normally independent, hid under the bed, and my dog barked towards the front door, especially at night. Initially, I thought they were reacting to a stray animal, but now I know they were probably sensing Carlos's presence. I decided to enhance my security by installing an additional lock and making sure all windows were closed. But the night Carlos broke into my bedroom, I realized that no matter how many locks I installed, he had a master key. After Carlos's arrest, the police searched his apartment. They found a disturbing shrine with photos of me and personal items that had gone missing from my apartment. There were journals filled with notes about my daily routines, my likes and dislikes, and even conversations I had had on the phone. It was evident that Carlos had been spying on me for months, gathering information about me. During the trial, I learned that Carlos had developed an obsession with me from the day I moved in. He used to spy through his windows and followed my every move. Forensic psychologists described him as someone with an obsessive and delusional personality. Hearing these details made me feel even more vulnerable and exposed. Over time, I tried to rebuild my life. I joined a support group for stalking victims and found solace in sharing my experience with others who had gone through similar situations. However, the trauma affected me deeply. Night sounds kept me awake, and any creak or whisper filled me with panic. I decided to move to another city, far from where everything had happened. I found a new apartment in a nice neighborhood and made sure it had extra security measures. I also bought an alarm system and maintained close contact with my new neighbors, making sure we were all aware of any suspicious activity. My experience with Carlos taught me the importance of trusting my instincts. The warning signs were there from the beginning, but I ignored them, thinking I was just being paranoid. Now I know it's better to be safe than sorry. Even though the fear and paranoia still accompany me, I've found ways to deal with them. Therapy has helped me process the trauma and regain a sense of normalcy. Although I'll never forget what happened, I'm learning to live without letting fear control my life. As time passed, I discovered that my story had impacted others in the community. Some of my former neighbors banded together to create a neighborhood watch program, and local authorities began taking reports of harassment and suspicious behavior more seriously. My experience served as a reminder that we must all be vigilant and look out for one another. Now, years later, I can look back and see how much I've grown and learned from that experience. I still have moments of anxiety, but I'm no longer the scared person I once was. I've become an advocate for personal safety and well-being, sharing my story to help others recognize the signs of danger and act before it's too late. Carlos's story and my experience with him are a testament to the power of human resilience. Although it was a dark time in my life, I have emerged stronger and wiser, ready to face any challenge that comes my way. And although fear may never completely disappear, I know I can overcome it and move forward. Moving to a new house was supposed to be a fresh start for us. My wife, Lisa, and our two kids, Emma and Jake, were excited about the change. The house was perfect, situated in a quiet neighborhood with a big yard for the kids to play in. The only oddity was the house next door, old, abandoned, and shrouded in mystery. The neighbors told us that the house had been vacant for years. Its last occupants had vanished without a trace, leaving everything behind. The local kids made up ghost stories about it, claiming to see lights flickering in the windows at night. We laughed it off, attributing it to overactive imaginations. The first few weeks in our new home were blissful. The kids loved their new rooms, and Lisa and I enjoyed the peace and quiet. But then, strange things began to happen. It started with the lights. Late at night, we'd see a faint glow coming from the windows of the abandoned house. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but it became more frequent. One night, I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and headed next door. My curiosity piqued. The house was even creepier up close. The windows were dirty and cracked, and the front door was slightly ajar. I hesitated before stepping inside, the air thick with dust and decay. The interior was a time capsule, frozen in the moment its occupants had left. Furniture covered in sheets, toys scattered on the floor, and a calendar on the wall from 5 years ago. As I moved through the house, the faint glow drew me to the basement. The door was slightly open, and I could hear a low hum emanating from below. My heart pounded as I descended the stairs, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The basement was filled with old, forgotten belongings. In the center of the room was a large antique mirror, its surface covered in grime. The glow was coming from behind it. I reached out to touch the mirror, but before I could, I heard a voice, a soft, childlike whisper. "Help us." I spun around, but there was no one there. The voice seemed to come from the mirror itself. I backed away, my mind racing. What was this place? Who were these voices? I returned home, shaken but determined to find answers. I told Lisa what I had experienced, but she was skeptical. "Maybe it's just your imagination," she suggested. That house gives everyone the creeps. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The next day, I went to the local library and dug into the house's history. What I found was chilling. The previous owners, the Thompsons, had disappeared without a trace. They had 2 children, both of whom were never found. Rumors of hauntings and strange occurrences had plagued the house ever since. I showed Lisa the articles I found, and she started to share my concern. We decided to keep a closer watch on the house, not wanting to alarm the kids unnecessarily. A week later, our worst fears were realized. It was a Saturday, and the kids were playing in the yard. Lisa and I were inside when we heard Emma scream. We rushed outside, but she was nowhere to be found. Jake was crying, pointing towards the abandoned house. "Emma went inside," he sobbed. "She said she saw a little girl waving at her." Panic set in, and we raced next door. The front door was wide open, and we called out for Emma, our voices echoing through the empty rooms. There was no response. We split up to search the house, my heart pounding with every step. I made my way to the basement, the glow from the mirror still there. I called out her name, but there was only silence. Then I heard the whisper again. "Help us." I approached the mirror, my reflection staring back at me. But this time, there was something else. Behind me, in the mirror's reflection, was Emma, her face pale and eyes wide with fear. She was trying to say something, but no sound came out. I turned around, but she wasn't there. Panic gripped me as I realized she was trapped in the mirror, just like the voices I had heard before. I pounded on the glass, desperate to reach her. "Emma, hold on, I'm going to get you out." I frantically searched the basement for anything that might help free Emma. The mirror seemed to hum with a sinister energy, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. I found an old book on a dusty shelf, its pages filled with strange symbols and incantations. Desperation drove me to flip through it, hoping for a clue. Lisa's voice echoed down the stairs, her panic evident. "Did you find her?" "She's in the mirror," I shouted back. "I'm trying to figure out how to get her out." Lisa joined me, her eyes wide with terror as she saw Emma's reflection. "Oh my God, we have to do something." I showed her the book, and we pored over its pages together. One passage stood out, a ritual to break the connection between the physical world and the mirror realm. It required specific items, a candle, salt, and a piece of the person trapped inside. "We need something of Emma's," I said, my mind racing. "Did she have anything with her?" Lisa thought for a moment, then ran upstairs to Emma's room. She returned with a small stuffed bear, Emma's favorite toy. "This should work," she said, her voice trembling. We followed the instructions in the book, setting up the ritual as described. The candle flickered as we lit it, casting eerie shadows on the walls. We sprinkled the salt in a circle around the mirror, then placed the stuffed bear in the center. Holding hands, we began to chant the incantation, our voices shaky but determined. The mirror's surface began to ripple, and the whispers grew louder, almost deafening. The candle's flame flickered wildly, but we kept going, our eyes fixed on Emma's reflection. As we reached the final words of the incantation, the mirror's surface shuddered violently. There was a blinding flash of light, and we were thrown back, the book flying from my hands. When the light faded, the room was silent. The mirror was cracked, its surface dull and lifeless. I scrambled to my feet and rushed to it, my heart pounding. "Emma? Emma, are you there?" For a moment, there was nothing. Then, a soft voice responded. "Daddy?" I turned around to see Emma standing in the center of the salt circle, her eyes wide with confusion but unharmed. I rushed to her, scooping her up in my arms, tears of relief streaming down my face. Lisa joined us, hugging Emma tightly. "Thank God you're okay," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. We left the abandoned house, vowing never to return. The events of that night haunted us, but we were grateful to have Emma back. The house was eventually torn down, the land left vacant, a silent reminder of the darkness that had once lurked there. Life slowly returned to normal, though the experience left its mark on all of us. Emma had no memory of what had happened, for which we were grateful. We never spoke of the mirror or the voices again, but the sense of unease lingered, a constant reminder of the horrors we had faced. As for me, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had only scratched the surface of the mystery. The mirror was gone, but the darkness remained, hidden in the shadows, waiting for its next opportunity. And so, we lived with a newfound awareness of the unseen forces that lurked in the corners of our world, always vigilant, always wary, knowing that some doors should never be opened and some mysteries are better left unsolved. Driving alone at night on the legendary Route 66, you can't help but feel a shiver run down your spine. I've always loved the mystique of this iconic highway, but on this particular evening, my journey would become an unforgettable encounter with the supernatural. It was a cold, moonlit night as I cruised through the barren stretches of the Arizona desert. My mind drifted to the tales of Route 66, the stories that had always seemed like mere folklore. Little did I know, I was about to become part of one such tale. As I rounded a bend, my headlights illuminated a figure standing by the roadside. She was dressed in an old-fashioned white gown, her long hair cascading over her shoulders. I slowed down, wondering what she was doing out here alone at this hour. She raised her hand, thumb out, asking for a ride. I hesitated for a moment, but decided to help. After all, it's not every day you encounter a hitchhiker in the middle of nowhere. I pulled over and rolled down the window. "Do you need a ride?" I asked. She nodded silently and slipped into the passenger seat. Her presence was eerily quiet, and the chill in the air seemed to intensify. "Where are you headed?" I inquired, trying to make conversation. "Just a little further down the road," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. We drove in silence for a while. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of the wind outside. There was something unsettling about her, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I glanced over at her, but she was staring straight ahead, her expression unreadable. As we approached a small bridge, she suddenly turned to me. "Stop here," she said abruptly. I pulled over, confused. "Are you sure? There's nothing here?" "Yes," she insisted. "This is where I need to be." She got out of the car and stood by the roadside, looking out into the darkness. I watched her for a moment, then decided to continue my journey. Just as I was about to drive off, I looked back one last time. She was gone, completely vanished. I was bewildered. There was no way she could have disappeared so quickly. I got out of the car and searched the area, calling out for her, but there was no trace. It was as if she had never been there. I got back in my car, my heart pounding. I continued driving, but the encounter left me shaken. When I finally reached the next town, I stopped at a diner to gather my thoughts. I told the waitress about the woman in white. She listened, her eyes widening. "You saw her?" she asked, her voice hushed. "The lady in white?" I nodded. "Who is she?" The waitress leaned in, lowering her voice. "There's a legend about a woman who died in a car accident on that bridge many years ago. People say her spirit still haunts the road, looking for a ride. Some say she's searching for her lost love. Others believe she's trying to find her way home. But everyone who sees her, they say she disappears without a trace." A chill ran down my spine. I had become part of the legend of Route 66. The encounter with the lady in white was something I would never forget, a ghostly reminder of the mysterious and eerie charm that this historic highway holds. Over the following days, I couldn't shake the memory of that night. I kept replaying the scene in my mind, wondering if there was any way to explain what I had experienced. I decided to return to the bridge where I had dropped her off, hoping to find some clue that might shed light on the mystery. It was another cold night when I returned to the spot. I parked my car and walked to the middle of the bridge. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. As I stood there, I felt the same chill in the air. The silence was almost deafening, and I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. I called out, "Is anyone here?" My voice echoed in the stillness. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, I heard a faint whisper, so soft I could barely make it out. "Help me," it said. I spun around, my heart racing. There was no one there, but the voice had been real. It sounded like the woman I had picked up. Determined to get to the bottom of this, I decided to spend the night in my car, parked by the side of the road. The hours passed slowly. I kept my eyes on the bridge, waiting for any sign of the lady in white. Just as I was starting to doze off, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. There she was, standing in the middle of the bridge, looking just as she had that first night. I got out of the car and approached her slowly. "Who are you?" I asked. She turned to face me, her eyes filled with sadness. "I need to find him," she said. "I need to find my love." "Who is he?" I asked, stepping closer. "He promised he would wait for me," she whispered. "But I never made it. I was in an accident. I need to find him." I realized then that she was trapped, her spirit unable to move on because she was still searching for her lost love. "How can I help you?" I asked. She looked at me, her eyes pleading. "Find him for me. Tell him I'm sorry. Tell him I never stopped loving him." Before I could say anything else, she vanished again. But this time, I felt a sense of purpose. I had to help her find peace. I spent the next few days researching, trying to find any information about a woman who had died in a car accident on that bridge. It wasn't easy, but eventually I came across an old newspaper article about a young couple who had been separated by tragedy. The woman had died in a car accident on the bridge, and her fiancé had been waiting for her on the other side. I tracked down the man, who was now an elderly gentleman living in a nearby town. When I told him about my encounter with the lady in white, tears filled his eyes. "She never made it," he said, his voice breaking. "I waited for her, but she never came." I relayed her message to him, and he nodded, tears streaming down his face. "Thank you," he whispered. "I never stopped loving her either." With that, I felt a sense of peace. I knew that I had done what I could to help the lady in white find closure. As I drove away from the bridge for the last time, I felt a warmth in the air, as if her spirit had finally been set free.